The Rune Smith. Chapter 41, Getting a Better Deal. Roland spent the rest of the night in a cold cell. The people in this world apparently didn't care much about their prisoners. The place he had to be was infested with rats, was cold and uncomfortable. There wasn't even a bed or a chair to sit on, he had to lean against the wall. Luckily they let him keep his clothes that were thick enough to get him through this chilly night. He wondered if these guards would be punished if it came to light that he was an actual noble's son. There were laws in place that forbid imprisonment of nobles in places like this before a trial. Even then, most sentences would at most strip some of the noble's status, or they just had to pay a fine and take a blow to their reputation. The aristocrats took things like this very seriously here. Some would even rather die than be stripped of their titles and lands. They would fight with all their might against things like that ever happening, even if it got bloody. He couldn't really sleep, so he had some time to think. He was worried that someone would ransack his workshop and even steal his money. He had most of his possessions in his spatial bag that was confiscated on the way here. He had to give it away as he didn't really have any other option. He didn't think anyone would want this magic paddle design. The magic scrolls that he had were another thing. He even had some that were meant for the store. Roland frowned at his lack of power. He needed to improve himself faster if he ever wished to be self-sufficient. He was lucky that the assassin didn't take him seriously. Otherwise, he would probably be dead. The person he was going against was a tier 2 and probably proficient at assassination. Hiding his true abilities was apparently the smart choice. Until he reached a certain threshold, it would probably be unwise to show off more of his skills. The night continued, and in the morning someone finally decided to shop up. It was another guard that came to pick him up, and he looked a bit apprehensive while opening his cell. "You may leave," he said while prompting Roland to go outside. This was a surprise. The other guards told him that he would be questioned in the morning. For some reason he was free to go. Could they really have figured out his true identity? Roland's heart rate increased at that thought, as he really didn't want to go back to his cozy family. "I'm free to go? Why?" he asked while hoping for the best. "Yes, someone vouched for you," the guard replied while the two started going out. He didn't look like a person that would know much, so Roland decided to leave it at this. He was brought to another room and was handed his bag of holding. He instantly checked if nothing was taken and if all of the coins, items, and scrolls were there. Only after doing this, he decided to leave. Outside he received the answer to why he was allowed to leave without much hassle. There was a co-worker from the Exier company there to greet him. The store he was working for was called Exier's Magic Emporium, but the whole company was just named by the owner. There were various other chain stores. You could even find some restaurants in some other cities. This company was even a notch above the other merchant council members. The person he was looking at wasn't someone that he was particularly familiar with. He had seen him around the store, and he mostly took care of some odd jobs. He was of the halfling race, and he was also an aspiring alchemist working in the store. Their ages were similar, but the halfling here was just in his first tier 1 class. This was also why he needed to do cumbersome work. He was one of those people that signed one of the less stellar contracts. "Fasco, was it? Why are you here?" Roland asked while walking out of the guard post he was imprisoned in. Buildings like this were spread throughout the city and used as temporary holding for criminals. The person would await the decision of an officer before getting transferred to a larger jail or let go. Things like trials weren't a thing for common people with no money. An officer had enough power to take care of such things instead of a judge. The city lords would only care if the person getting accused was someone with money or friends in high places. Fasco looked up to Roland with a slight frown on his face. The two started work at about the same time, but the human was getting a lot more attention. This made the halfling youth a bit jealous. "Not like I wanted to come here. The boss just told me to give the guard captain a letter in the morning." "Is that so? Anything else?" Roland replied while asking. "No." Fasco was also ordered to wait for Roland and tend to any of his needs. He didn't want to reveal that part though. Roland figured this out as the youth remained in place even though he should be done with his assignment. You can leave, I don't need anything else from you, I'll go talk to the manager myself. The halfling flinched after Roland somehow found out about his ploy. He was now slightly worried that the human would tell this to his boss and he would be punished. Roland on the other hand didn't care and didn't want the halfling to bother him anymore. After some back and forth, Fasco and Roland finally went their own ways. The human youth needed to go talk with his supervisor. He had a suspicion that the thieves weren't there to rob him but just to assassinate him instead. He didn't recall offending anyone in the city, he mostly kept to himself for the time he spent here. The only person who could be after his life would be someone from his own family that he left behind. Though it was a bit far-fetched that he was found here or that they would risk making moves in the territory of a count. The possibility was still there, but the probability was quite low. The more plausible theory was that it was related to Exier. They suspiciously bailed him out from the prison without him even having to ask for it. He also knew that there were some shady things happening in the background. He heard rumors about shipments getting robbed and increased thief activity. He needed more information. The gnome manager was probably informed about what was happening here. Before that, he returned to his humble workshop. When he arrived, he spotted a guard. He was also a worker from Exier's Emporium. This was a bit surprising, either the company cherished him as a worker or they were just defending their asset. There were even some men checking out the blown-up window and the trashed room. He didn't really talk with them much before going inside. He was sure to hide the runic equipment he was making in his spatial bag, but he didn't have enough time to hide every little thing yesterday night. Some information leaks could have happened and his boss might already know that he could craft runes. That is if he didn't already know the moment he changed classes just like last time. Roland needed to make another decision. His life was at stake yet again, he could either run away or somehow work it through. The only people that he could realistically rely on here were the people from the company that hired him. It at least seemed that they were willing to help him by the fact that they bailed him out of jail. They were even fixing his workshop. He also hoped it was free of charge. He wasn't sure if he wanted to live there anymore after what happened. Before making a final decision, he needed to have a talk with the gnome manager. He didn't really want to leave the city, everything he needed to train his smithing class was already here. Starting from the bottom in a new place would be tiring, but if he needed to leave then he wouldn't hesitate. He had done it successfully before and he could do it once more. There was one thing he thought about making now, a bicycle. After going back and forth so many times, he was thinking about crafting one. With his current skills, it would be difficult. The hardest thing would probably be the chain along with the chain ring. He also would probably have to make one without tires, which would bring the comfort down quite a bit. There were things like airless tires, he could probably go in that direction if he found the right material. While thinking about the validity of a bicycle powered by runes and with speed buffs, he arrived at the store. He entered as usual and headed up to the second floor. No one stopped him and he didn't need the Sun Elf woman to guide him there either, as everyone knew him here already. He even saw her going out of the gnome's office. She had a less than stellar look on her face. Roland wouldn't ask her about it though. It was slightly strange, she always did bother him with the big sister nonsense whenever he saw her. This time around she looked preoccupied with her own thoughts. Roland wasn't one to bother others, so he just knocked on the door and waited. After a few seconds, he got a reply. "Who is it? I'm busy." He heard the grumpy voice of the gnome that he still didn't know the name of. "It's me, Roland. I'm here to talk about what happened last night," he replied while still waiting outside. "Already? Fine, come in and close the door behind you." So he did. The manager was just sitting there with his pipe in his mouth. He didn't seem to be that busy, but he did have a solemn look on his face. After a moment of silence, the older man was the first one to speak up. "You all right, kid? It's not easy to kill someone that is a tier above you. So, you've already heard of it? What else do you know?" the youth quickly asked while moving closer to the manager. The old gnome just blew out some smoke through his nose. He looked at Roland while thinking about his next sentence. I guess I should tell you about this. You've probably figured out that this wasn't simple burglary. Roland raised his brow slightly. It looked like the gnome was willing to talk. He expected him to dance around the problem and maybe giving him some snippets of information here and there. The whole thing was indeed suspicious. Why would a Tier 2 thief try to rob an old warehouse with a Tier 1 blacksmith inside? They moved for profit and there was none to get there, even the runic equipment he made wasn't worth the hassle. Yeah, those guys weren't there to rob me. They went straight to my room. Oh? You saw them go to your room? The manager cut Roland off before he could continue. Clearly interested in the fact that the youth somehow saw the burglars go into his house. Then he was even able to somehow evade their detection to witness them go into his room. Yes, I saw them. I hid my presence with one of my runic scrolls. Roland didn't feel like denying his abilities in this instance mattered much. The person here knew that he was able to make runic scrolls and he only used one of them to hide in the shadows. Interesting, but how did you know that they were there? Somehow the conversation shifted to the manager asking Roland about the previous night while the youth answered. He gave him a shortened version including the detection spell usage along with the other spell that allowed him to hide in the shadows. He didn't mention that the life detection spell was inscribed on metal though. HOH? Not bad there, kid, not bad at all. The manager nodded at the explanation, but he was fast to point out the inconsistencies within it. Detect life? That spell has a limited range, to use scrolls for it would be a bit costly. Roland remained silent and didn't really confirm his new class choice. His boss didn't really need to know everything as he didn't know if he could trust him with everything. Think we went off topic there. So, do you know why they came to that warehouse for a no-name blacksmith or scribe like me? There is nothing there of value to steal either. He finally got fed up with the questions and asked directly. There isn't. The gnome smirked a bit, which caused Roland to think that he knew something. The manager finally decided to reply to the question after seeing the youth's face scrunching up. We've been having problems recently, things going missing, shipments misplaced, customers complaining. The gnome started listing some things that were going wrong. He also mentioned that this wasn't an isolated incident and that other stores and establishments that didn't belong to him were getting attacked by an unknown force. Do you know who it is? Are they going to do it again? Shouldn't the city lord get involved in something like this? Roland naturally asked as he still feared for his life. There was no guarantee that someone wouldn't come for him during the night again. The city lord don't count on the nobles to do anything, kid. You can stop worrying, I had someone look into it. Nothing like this will happen again, I can guarantee you this. The manager said while blowing out some smoke from his mouth. You can guarantee it? Roland replied while tilting his head to the side and slightly frowning. He still wasn't sure if he could trust the old man. He didn't interact with him that much even though he had been working for him for over a year now. We will also install a safety barrier around that warehouse workshop of yours, so stop worrying and get back to work. Also, you can have these. The gnome turned to the side and threw 2 books towards Roland. The youth grabbed them nicely thanks to his high dexterity stat. He looked at the 2 books wondering what this was about. His eyebrow shot up slightly the moment he read the titles of these books. The first one contained the knowledge of runesmith skills he already knew. It was a runecraft skill book that would be something blacksmiths with a monoscribe class would want to get their hands on. After learning it, they would be allowed to change their classes to runesmith. Normally he would be happy about this, but he already had learned this skill. The other one was more interesting though. The title was Runic Ethereal Pathways and How to Use Them in Runesmithing. This one was more of a brow raiser. From the long name of this skill book he had an idea what it was about. This felt like it was a more intricate skill that runesmiths should only be able to get. Roland looked to the gnome, his eyes going a bit wider along with his mouth. He was speechless for a moment, but he kind of knew that the gnome was giving him this as a sort of apology and also a bribe. Before he could voice a question, the manager spoke out first. I was saving the first one till you were in the later levels, but it doesn't seem that you will be needing it anymore. It will still increase your skill progress, so you should read it. So you knew? Roland asked while grasping the accessory that was supposed to keep his status hidden. The guards had taken it away while he was in the jail cell. He had put it back during the way here. Did someone check his status before he got there, or did the manager search his warehouse? I have my ways, no use hiding your skills from me, kid, I'm not your enemy. I'll give you a good price for everything you make, remember that well. Roland looked at the 2 skill books. He could throw them back and have the gnome owe him for not being able to protect him. He realized that his boss knew something but would probably not give him detailed information. The new skill that he received was tempting, though a skill book like this would cost many golden coins if he tried buying it himself. The company he was working for seemed to be increasing the defensive measures at his workshop. It would probably be still a gamble to remain there, moving to a safer district would be more appropriate. The gnome also never mentioned his noble status, so the Arden estate probably wasn't involved. This only left a few other options, one being that it was a feud between this company and another force. It would probably be better for him if it was only that. Otherwise, it meant that someone hated him enough to send assassins after him. That possibility was low if he took out his noble status from the equation. Can I get a guarantee on a contract? He asked while the gnome clenched his jaw tightly and wanted to shout out some profanities at the youth. You smelly brat, just because you have a prestige class, don't get too cocky. It is because of it that I am, though. I'd sleep better knowing I have a nice contract protecting my life. Someone once told me that my class was unique and worth a lot. Would be sad if someone with a rare class like that just walked away, wouldn't it? Roland quickly replied while the manager's expression got quite ugly. His nose was really scrunched up and the hand that was holding the pipe was shaking around furiously. Roland actually felt some kind of strange pressure coming from that small body. He wasn't sure how strong this gnome was, but he was probably a tier 3. The small body started looking really huge the more he continued to stare at him. Look at this cheeky brat. The gnome started laughing uncomfortably before giving another reply. You want a contract, very well. But it won't be as one-sided as you want it to be. The manager's eyes showed a strange glint as he busted out some paper and a pen. A strenuous re-evaluation of his old contract awaited him. He knew he was in for a different kind of battle. He needed to see if the new contract clauses didn't screw him over in the long run. Luckily he had gone through a lot of books and knew how to handle these types of situations. He at least had to get a new location for his workshop that wasn't so close to the slums. Chapter 42 Hidden Trouble and a New Yet Old Workshop. 2 pale crescent moons shone like silvery claws in the night sky. The sky was free of clouds, which let everyone see a blanket of bright stars that seemed to stretch into infinity. A certain person was sitting in a room. The candle light danced in a gentle wind, making the person's shadow sway. The person looked to be a man in his 20s and he was wearing an exquisite tunic. There were various precious gems sewed into it, and the person was also wearing a costly-looking necklace. He wore a kind of large padded shoes of black leather. The toes were round and gored over the foot with colored material. The sleeves on his tunic were puffed and there was a kind of cap to the side with a white feather in it. On one of the man's hands a large ring was worn with what looked to be an insignia. It was clear from the man's appearance that he was some kind of noble. He was busy reading a long letter and was already on the last page. The moment he finished he crumbled it up and pointed his finger at it. The parchment quickly went up in flames after a surge of fire mana assaulted it. The Thieves' Guild won't cooperate anymore, damn idiots got caught. Those peasants dare resist? I need to acquire those assets at a lower cost before it is too late. The man rubbed his chin while looking at the piece of paper that was going up in flames. He continued to stare at it till it finally turned into dust. The moment it did, a knock was heard on the door. Enter. The man that entered was wearing a shiny suit of armor. The candle light was bouncing off the chest plate that had some intricate designs on it. The person that was wearing the armor put his hand on his chest as a greeting. He had the same insignia on his chest piece that the man had on his ring. It was clearly a noble house emblem that they both belonged to. "My lord, the Merchant Council has now become more aware of our movements. We are also unable to proceed with the plan as the guild refuses to cooperate." The man sitting there just nodded as the knight continued talking. He raised his hand, making him stop. He already read a more thorough report from other sources, so he didn't need to listen to this. "I know. We must alter it, pull out for now, and let them think that they were successful. Not like they can do anything even if they know that we were responsible. They have no valid proof or the rank to call for a court hearing. Commoners will always be peasants with no actual power." The man stood up and went to the side. The knight remained in place, his posture straight. The nobleman slowly walked over to a large cabinet filled with various liquors. He took his time in picking out one before sitting himself back in a more comfortable chair. The man in the shiny armor remained standing without uttering a word. He waited through the whole ordeal. The man poured himself some of that liquid into a tall glass and started to slowly sip it. "They know their place, they won't be foolish enough to act against me. If that guild doesn't want to act, we will just hire someone else, get in touch with them." The knight's eyebrows quivered slightly as he listened to his lord talking. "My lord, do you mean?" the knight asked while being taken aback slightly. "Yes, their methods might be brutal, but they get the job done and they won't abandon their mission like those useless thieves. I still have some time before he can return from the border, 2 years. This city's assets have to belong to me by then." The man stopped himself from talking further and then looked at the knight that was just standing there. The man frowned and in a fit tossed the half-drunk glass filled with red liquor at the knight. The man didn't dodge and glass shattered all over his suit of armor. "What are you waiting for?" "Yes, my lord, it shall be done." The knight did his salute and walked out of the room. After leaving, he made sure to call up some maids to clean up the mess in the lord's study. He didn't like what his young master was planning, but he couldn't go against him. He had sworn an oath and he had to carry out his knightly duties. The 2 silver moons continued to brighten the sky like 2 crescent daggers. Soon a new day dawned, bringing new events with it. Roland had his work cut out for him. The manager was very serious about his contracts. Its re-evaluation took some time to process. The gnome needed a good reason to invest more resources into Roland. This reason would be his 3rd class, as some of his runic items were already discovered during the burglary attempt. Roland wasn't sure when his boss found out, but it was no use hiding his increased worth anymore. The gnome manager was happy to hear about the runic blacksmith variant. Due to this, he agreed to more funding and protection. He would be moved to a different location where he could train his craft in peace. The only downside of this, he needed to actually produce usable runic equipment. What came with it was a big raise and a slight drop in the percentages he needed to pay for his items to the store. Crafting runes wasn't all that hard for him. Most of the problems came from the exorbitant amount of mana he burned during the crafting process. The hard part was the smithing, as he was barely able to make passable smithing tools. Even something like nails were hard to produce. He also agreed to an extension of the contract by a year. From what he calculated, it would probably take him years to max out this class. He gained meager amounts of experience from making metal tools or weapons. The only thing that gave him a lot of experience was rune crafting. The number of points he gained for making runic scrolls went down after his promotion. If you wanted to level up with a specialized class, you needed to focus on its skills and proficiencies. The only other way would be getting a lot of rune schematics. Even if he got all the way up to a rune smith, it would be good to have a working smithy to continue. There was no reason for him to leave if the assassination attempts stopped. The contract stated that the company would pay a fine and Roland would be able to cancel it. This was only if harm came to him due to his involvement with Exier's company. He barely got used to living in the shady warehouse and he would already be moving somewhere else. Of course, it was another unused warehouse with a similar layout but with fewer cobwebs this time around. After the new contract went through, the company abandoned the repairs on the other one and outfitted his new workshop with better tools. Roland was now sitting in his new office. It looked strangely similar to the old one. This really was just a less run-down version of the older building. He placed the 2 skill books that he received as compensation on his desk. After some time his rune smithing went up to level 2, but this wasn't enough to make crafting comfortable. He grabbed the corresponding skill book and began reading it. It was similar to the one he read during his class change quest, but not quite. A person could somehow increase their skill level after reading skill books, but it wasn't by a set point. Due to this, there was no reason to save it till he got his skill up to level 8. The reader would get a hidden number of experience points towards the given skill, and if it was enough it would just go up. The skill book he read while changing his class went together with a lesser fire resistance rune. This one also came together with a basic diagram. The one here would be quite useful for his current class. It came with a lesser fortitude rune. This rune would increase the user's endurance by a flat amount up by 5 if he got it into the highest rating. He already knew that he couldn't stack too many pieces of equipment like that onto one person. Armor that raised the user's stats like that came at a cost. It would temporarily lower the maximum number of mana by a set number. For instance, if someone had 1000 points of mana and decided to use magical gloves with that fortitude enchantment, their mana pool would be lowered by 100 points. This meant that a person with that amount of mana could theoretically have 10 such runes on his equipment. The same debuffs applied though. A person would start feeling a strain if their mana went below 30%. That was the usual cutoff at which the cons outweigh the pros. Of course, there were some ways to lower the mana costs. One was monster cores, the other was skills. Thanks to Roland's runic master skill, he could wear more runic equipment than your regular adventurer. Due to these conditions, most runesmiths didn't put more than 1 or 2 enchantments on a given piece of armor. You'd mostly see sets divided into gloves, boots, helmets, chest armor, and pants or skirts. To this, you could throw in a belt and some accessories. This segregated the type of enchantments into 2 categories. First were the self-sufficient ones that didn't require the user's mana. Second, the less desired ones that came at the price of limiting your capabilities slightly. Even with there only being those 2 types, there were further subcategories of them. Like ones that could be charged at special runic shops and worked for a limited time without the user powering it. The type that cost the most was the one that could recharge themselves with the ambient mana in the air. They were also the hardest to make. From what Roland knew, you somehow had to integrate a sufficiently large mana core into the item. Such a process was kept secret by the more advanced runesmiths. The only rumor he heard was that you somehow melted the mana stones into the items. How you did it he didn't know. If he switched classes he might get such a skill for free. Runecraft skill level 3 reached. After finishing the first skill book, he heard the world's system pronounce that it had leveled up. This would make things easier to craft from now on. Now came the second skill book. He grabbed it from the desk and began reading. This one was about ethereal pathways and was also a skill that runesmiths could attain. If he could nab it was still up to debate though, as he was only a runic blacksmith and not a runesmith. He continued reading the skill book. The system rules this world worked on somehow aided people in gaining skills that were used by their classes. The person going through it would somehow get it as long as their attributes allowed it. There was some kind of hidden counter that if achieved would allow this. Just as he had thought, this skill would allow him to connect his runes on parts that weren't one large piece of metal. The brigandine armor was a good example. It consisted of many metallic plates riveted to fabric. With this skill, he would only need to inscribe the rune on one of those plates and then connect them via these ethereal traces. Those pathways existed on some kind of different wavelength and weren't impacted by world physics that much. There was of course a limit on how far the different pieces could be from each other. He couldn't make a connection from a boot to a glove. The craftsman could at most get in a few centimeters, otherwise the whole runic structure would become unstable. This technique also made it possible to inscribe runes on some softer materials like cloth. Ethereal pathway skill L1 has been learned. Intelligence +1. It took him a couple of hours to go through this book. He had even gained a bonus point to intelligence along with the new skill. He had all the requirements to produce runic weapons and armor, the only problem was that he still sucked at making anything besides the runes. He thought about one way to go around this issue and make a large sum of money in the process. Did he really have to be the one to craft swords or shields by himself? He could go to an armorsmith or weaponsmith and get himself a regular steel sword. He could then put his runes on it and sell it for a good amount of money. He wasn't sure if there were any copyright or trademark laws against things like that though. Would a weaponsmith come knocking on his door if they spotted their sword being resold with an attached rune to it? There was a way for a craftsman to identify his own weapon. He knew this as he could easily identify his own creations. Other people couldn't see the craftsman's name but the creator could. I should probably ask the company about this, they could probably procure me items that won't offend anyone. He thought to himself while grabbing a mug filled with warm black tea. If he went through Exier Network they would probably supply him something worthwhile. They owned various businesses around the city, they didn't really have a runesmith on their payroll but that would be changing soon. Even with this, he wouldn't abandon his smithing class. He still needed to work on his tool masteries, he was very keen on crafting his own weapons. He knew that a person required vast amounts of resources to do this. Making a magic sword would probably bring him in a lot more money than making runic scrolls. He could only create weapons with limited charges and ones that lowered the user's mana by a fixed amount. Still, there was a market for it and it was booming. Roland turned to the window and looked outside, the workers were almost done with carrying everything inside. He would become busy once again. The biggest thing holding him back was his mana usage. He needed to lower the strain on himself, he needed to get some better crafting equipment. He would achieve this by getting something that increased his mana regeneration or its amount. He had already managed to get a lesser mana regeneration magic ring from his boss. It was one of the things that he managed to insert into his contract. Even the lesser ones cost a huge number of coins, so it was worth signing a 1-year extension just for this. With it on, he could increase his production rate by about 15%. He wanted to earn enough money to get similar products and increase his mana abilities even further. The workers were still setting up his new workshop, so he took out some magical paper and his quill. Time was of the essence and he could use it to practice his scribing strokes. It was a drag that he couldn't level up his basic skill further due to not being a tier 2 class yet. The more he crafted, the more experience he got and the faster he could get his advanced class. What it would be in the end was still unknown to him, but he hoped it would also be a unique one. So he went to work, the new workshop would soon be very busy. He would also be getting a part-time assistant, finally, he would have an employee under himself to order around. So the next day came. His new workshop looked exactly the same as the old one. The walls were slightly more sturdy though, and the catwalk would probably not give out under his weight anymore. The person that was going to help him out with some chores was supposed to be here now. They were already late, which didn't bode well. "Hello? I'm from the guild. I'm here to work part-time." He heard someone call out from outside. The voice sounded familiar and high-pitched, which indicated that the person was probably a woman. This wasn't much of a problem as spatial bags existed and he only needed someone to help him clean and do some odd jobs here and there. "Yes, could you start by clean? What are you doing here?" Roland opened the door and saw a familiar half-gnome girl standing before him. She was wearing better adventurer gear and looked less pouty. Roland. It was one of his old party members, Helsi, and she was apparently going to be his new assistant. Chapter 43 More Smithing. "You were a blacksmith? But aren't you a mage? Why would you? Did I get the wrong house?" Helsi was standing in front of Roland and her mouth was moving fast. She had examined the inside of this workshop and was now barraging him with questions. She had picked up this quest as a side job. She was back to doing the transport missions with her old party and taking a safer approach to the whole adventurer life. This left time for her to pick up part-time work like this. She didn't expect to find the poker-faced mage she adventured around a few months ago here though. Even less that he was now apparently a blacksmith. Well no, I switched recently. But you were so strong back there, aren't you wasting away in this dump? You should be fighting monsters. Thanks to how many ants they slew, Helsi had leveled up to a second tier 1 class. She had taken the hunter class that boosted better tracking and bow use. It was also a class that was good with short swords and would let her level up to a ranger class on the tier 2 change. Didn't you have enough fighting monsters? Thought you'd slow down after the way that grotto mission went. Roland replied with another question. He'd thought that the girl would see some reason and relax. However, she was as active as always. Adventuring was the thing she wanted to do. This raised another question though. Shouldn't you have left for a city with a dungeon by now? The girl flinched slightly and let her head down. She then looked back up to Roland while blushing. Her left and right index fingers were now poking against each other while looking at her old party comrade. I don't have enough money to make the trip. Roland raised his brow and took a glance at what Helsi was wearing. She indeed had some higher tier gear. Her sword seemed to be enchanted in some way and the clothes were spanking new. The armor she was wearing was hard leather and she might have had some more goodies hidden in her spatial bag. So even if you wanted, you don't have enough for the train ride? Can't you just take an escort mission to a city with a dungeon? Roland asked while placing some smithing tools on his workbench. You think it's that easy? Maybe if my stupid party wanted to move with me. She slumped on one of the chairs while sighing and then started talking. Roland certainly didn't think that he would be having such a heart-to-heart talk with his new assistant. Helsi told him that due to the lack of funds it was hard to move. She wouldn't have much left for an inn and she would need to find a new party. She was someone that just switched to her second tier 1 class and considered a newbie. She might not be able to find a party that wouldn't rip her off if she moved. There was also the problem that a city with a dungeon wasn't anywhere close to where Edelgard was. Roland was making a lot of money by crafting his scrolls, but a new steel-grade adventurer wasn't. After the failed mission, the guild only rewarded them partially as there was no proof that the client lied about the ants being there. Helsi spent most of her hard-earned cash on her new equipment and recovery potions and was not left with much besides that. She was a scout and a hunter, so she also had the added cost of arrows. The costs added and she was left with living from paycheck to paycheck. The paycheck being whatever she got from the Adventurer Guild. It would take her some time until she gathered enough to travel. After going through the mine experience and then spending most of her coins, she did some thinking. She now knew that she got overzealous with her expenditure. This time around she needed to gather enough money to have a fallback plan. This was also why she was now here, earning more as an errand girl. To Roland, this didn't explain why he was getting the girl as an assistant. He thought he would get someone that at least had some basic smithing knowledge. Would this girl even be able to identify the crafting materials he ordered her to get? I see you should be careful with your money in the future. You can start working by cleaning the office then. Roland had to stay and listen to the girl complain for 15 minutes about her adventurer party. He didn't have the whole day for something like this. He needed to craft more items and train his smithing skills. Slave driver! The orange-haired girl shouted at him before grabbing an empty bucket to fetch some water. She wasn't someone with high strength, but with the added levels she was stronger than your average human man that didn't have a class. Roland didn't need her for anything else at the moment. It felt kind of strange to have someone follow his orders around. Was this how all the business owners felt when they ordered their workers? The girl vanished behind the warehouse doors after going out. The well for the water was about 5 minutes from this spot. While she was gone, Roland decided to turn on the forge and get started. Today he would craft a utility knife. He was also in the possession of a lesser sharpness rune which would go with it nicely. That is if he managed to compress the rune enough to fit the small knife. He would be making the knife out of some leftover tools that weren't usable. He would be making it from a rusty horse hoof rasp, which was used for filing down horse hoofs. Half of it was rusted and he just needed about 8 inches of the handle part. It was already broken in half so he wouldn't need to cut it. It was also made from steel and not iron this time around. First, he needed to heat it up to a nice red color. He then began hammering the handle end of the file over the near side of his anvil until it was half an inch wide. By using the handle end of the file he would save himself a lot of time on forging. He made sure to knock back the sharp corners where the file handle began to create a taper, this prevented cold shuts from forming. He then drew out the handle taper until it was long enough. Drawing and tapering to lengthen thin steel were the most common techniques a crafter would use as a blacksmith. When you drew steel out, you used flat hammer blows to make a section of steel uniformly thinner and longer. Tapering used angled hammer blows, often with the piece of metal held at an angle to the face of the anvil, to narrow a section of metal on an angle. So he drew out the blade of the file until it was slightly over an inch wide at the shoulder of the handle. He then created a one-sided taper by holding the spine of the knife flat on the anvil and while holding his hammer at an angle. Roland bent the handle over the horn of the anvil in the middle and brought the tip completely around. He did it so that it was flat against the spine side with a loop at the end. He then started to grind the blade evenly on both sides until it was just right. He couldn't grind it too thin before hardening, otherwise, it might have become brittle and crack in the process of making. Next came the process of annealing. To normalize or anneal steel, was to slowly cool it after forging to let the steel or metal grain structure relax and refine. This reduced the chances that the steel would shatter when it is hardened. For the basic blacksmith, normalizing meant to slowly cool the steel near the fire, while annealing meant to very slowly cool the steel in an insulating material such as ash. So he continued by annealing the knife. He heated it up first so that it would become non-magnetic and then he let it cool in a bucket of ash. After annealing it, he heated it back up to a non-magnetic state again just to then quench the blade in oil. Following this, he tempered the blade after repolishing the edges. He did this by holding the blade upside down and waiting until the blade showed a straw yellow color and then he quenched it again. A yellow color was the hardest temper, used for cutting tools such as wood carving chisels and slicing knives such as this. It was best used for anything that needed a hard, strong edge at the expense of a higher chance of chipping or cracking. He was now mostly done with his creation. He just needed to add the rune part and then polish it. Maybe add a wooden or cloth handle so he wouldn't need to hold it by the cold steel. The steel would make rune crafting more difficult, but he had leveled up this skill thanks to the skill book. While he was examining his creation, he noticed someone standing next to him. He jumped back as Helsi had her face shoved right next to him as she watched him working. What are you doing? Nothing, finished cleaning that room, but you were busy working so I didn't want to disturb you. You really are a blacksmith, aren't you? Also here, have one. Roland looked at the smaller girl. In her hand was a ripe red apple. He looked at her then back to her hand before taking the apple. He realized that he was actually a bit hungry after having forged this knife for the first time. Thank you. No problem, just part of the job. Also. The girl paused while Roland took a bite out of the apple, some sweat running down his forehead. Are you good at forging arrows? She asked while glancing at him with her large eyes as if she was expecting something. Arrows? Haven't tried yet, shouldn't be too hard, just need a steel or iron rod. You can probably buy the arrow shafts at the woodworker, so I'd just need to make the arrowheads. Not sure if you can get the quills there though. He talked out loud while thinking that practicing on arrowheads could be better than making nails. He might be also able to inscribe some lesser runes on them. Arrow shafts and quills, okay, I'll be right back. Roland eyed Helsi that looked awfully happy for some reason. He had her as a temporary assistant for now. It was probably a good thing that it was a person that he knew. The girl was a bit off, but he could probably trust her. She was a good kid. The only problem with having an assistant was that he couldn't rune craft. He was still trying to hide his prestige class from others. He was far too young to be a proper runesmith, so intelligent people would probably put 2 and 2 together. While Helsi was out, he went back to working on his utility knife. It wouldn't work well as a weapon, it was too short for that. He mostly made it to train his smithing skills and then to train his rune inscribing. He had one of those grinding wheels to help him do the sharpening. It was even one of those that he could operate with his foot and not with a handle. He gave it a spin and sharpened his newly produced tool and then gave it a nice polish. Crude steel utility knife intermediate. His skills increased a bit, so he managed to finally get an intermediate ranking. The more he worked on something, the easier it became. He also knew that the smithing skills were somehow helping him out. He didn't even need to concentrate that much while shaping tools that he previously made. His body would shift into automatic gear and recreate what he already did. The more his skills went up, the higher the rating on the items became. While Roland was happy about his new creation, his assistant showed up again. She was holding 10 wooden sticks that looked like arrow shafts and quills. She placed the items that she brought on the table and looked to her new kid boss with a smile on her face. "Here you go, I saw some iron bars here, so I didn't get those. Now you can make some arrowheads. Leave the quills to your lovely assistant." The girl nodded and started attaching the quills to the pre-made arrow shafts. The procedure wouldn't really be hard as everything was already prepared for her. The girl was really chipper about him making some arrowheads, and he already realized why. They probably won't be that good. He took one of the wooden arrow shafts that Helsi graciously brought over. He aligned it with some of the thinner iron rods that he had in the smithy and picked one that was the closest in thickness. Luckily he had a point mandrel that was close enough in width. This was just a pointy tool that allowed making consistent sockets for arrowheads. It was about 6 inches in length, and when he aligned it with the arrow shaft it looked to fit the size nicely. He wouldn't need to grind it down any further thanks to this. The forge was activated again and the piece of iron was placed inside to heat up. He left it there till it glowed a bright orange, similar to when he was working with the nails. He took the hot piece of metal to the anvil and started hammering the heated end. He was aiming for a rough spoon shape that was a little bit over 3 times as wide as the rest of the iron rod. He made sure to flatten it out nicely and to taper the ends thin. He then started folding the socket by placing it over the horn and hammering gently. After folding it a bit, he placed it back on the face of the anvil and started to gently round it out. He made sure to not overdo it, otherwise it could collapse onto itself or have sharp creases. After it was nicely rounded out, he grabbed the point mandrel from the side and inserted it into the created socket. He then proceeded to hammer it in so that the inside would fit the wooden arrow shaft later on. He needed to hammer it a few times from the sides so that it fit the tool better before it was done. He then used his hardy tool that was meant for cutting to cut away the partially done arrowhead from the iron stock. He grabbed his pliers from the side and grabbed the soon-to-be arrowhead with them by the socket side. He placed it back on the anvil and started to draw the arrowhead out into a 4-sided point. After he was done, he inserted the point mandrel back into the socket and did some finishing touches on the arrowhead. If he had a better grindstone, he could skip some of the hammerings to the tip and just sharpen it with it instead. It wasn't fast enough for such a thing, and he could only add some sharp edges instead. After about 20 minutes he was mostly done with it, and it was actually quite pointy at the end. After he used the grindstone to get rid of some uneven parts, he heated up the arrowhead once more. This was just so he could place it into some oil. This was to cool it off and give it a nice oxide finish to keep the point from rusting. He handed the finished arrowhead to his lovely assistant and told her to use some sandpaper on the inside of the socket and then to attach it to the arrow shaft while he worked on the rest. He had 9 to go, and the more he worked the faster he could finish. His high dexterity allowed him to better work with smaller parts like this, and he didn't fail even once. It took him about 3 hours to finish these up. In the end, he had 6 low and 4 intermediate iron bodkin arrowheads. He was actually happy with his work. The only problem was that these wouldn't sell for all that much, and he would probably earn more by scribing more scrolls in the night. "Here, you can take them, just pay me for the iron." Helsi grinned widely after Roland gave the arrows to her for close to nothing. He knew what she was planning, but he didn't really care. He just used this as practice. If he ever made a runic version of the arrow, he would charge her normally. "You're the best boss in the whole wide world. Don't worry, I'll be sure to cook you some good food. I bet you've been only eating out in those cheap restaurants. She wasn't wrong. Roland mostly just went to the closest place in the neighborhood and didn't even care if the food was bland. He even received a nicely cooked stew for his work that almost brought a smile on his face. So his life as a blacksmith continued. His levels were rising slowly, but he knew that if he continued he would finally be able to craft something special. Chapter 44 Borrowing Runes. Days went by and Roland continued to practice his craft. He created regular tools most of the day, which he then melted down for crafting materials. They were far too crude to sell, and any responsible blacksmith made his or her own tools. With the help of his temporary assistant, he didn't need to go to restaurants every day. She would cook and clean and he would help her out by crafting arrow shafts. With this, his smithing masteries were increasing at a steady pace. This only left his level that was increasing at a snail's pace. Even rune crafting doesn't give me that much experience. Roland gave out a sigh while hammering another one of his creations. He was making a door handle for his new workshop as the old one had fallen off. He could have just repaired it, but he would be given fewer points. He was just adding the finishing touches by bending each side of the handle on the horn of his anvil. After it was finished, he just needed to attach the new iron handle via nails to the wooden door. The door didn't have a lock, just a simple latch that he could use to close it from one side. His basic forging and basic smithing mastery were at level 4. They were leveling up fast if you compared it to his blacksmith's level that was only 3 after all this time. The books weren't joking around when they said that taking a third tier 1 class would be a headache. If he continued like this, he would max out all of his basic crafting skills before he even reached level 10 with his runic blacksmith class. This was something that he expected would happen sooner or later. It felt like a big waste of time though. He would be stuck with skills that couldn't be upgraded even if he continued working hard. It might have been even better to level up other skills that he ignored after that happened, like his stealth, running or weapon proficiencies. With the added blacksmith strength and endurance, he would be able to handle some heavier weapons. Before that happened though, there was one thing he wanted to do. That was to draw as many rune schematics as humanly possible. He had bought all of the runic scrolls that were in the city already. There weren't that many of them, to begin with, as most runesmiths would rather hammer red-hot iron than hold a quill in a dark room. This left him with not much to work with. Only some basic elemental spells like the arrow series. There were also some situational ones like the lesser shadow veil and the life detection spell. He needed to get more armor and weapon-related spells like the impact rune or detonation rune he received. The problem was that even the cheapest piece of armor cost at least a few small gold coins. He didn't have enough gold to go around and buy enchanted armor to level up. One option was to buy an enchanted sword with a popular rune. Learn how to craft it himself thanks to his debugging skill. Then order some swords and add the rune to it. This would probably be one of the better options, and he could ask the gnome manager to sell his items without people knowing that it was him. The only downside was that rune crafting still sucked him dry of mana. He probably wouldn't be able to make that many weapons. Also, he would need to stop making his scrolls due to not having any mana left after. There was something he could do before that, something that in theory would allow him to get rune schematics free of charge. The problem with that was that it was probably illegal, and if he got caught he might go to jail. Getting caught was improbable, mostly due to the nature of the task he would be performing. I should give it a try. I need to test it out in the field. Roland rubbed his chin before hammering the door handle into place. The one he made even looked better than the old one, which showed him that he was really improving his craft. His assistant was out on adventures for a few days, so he had some free time to do some tests. The next day came around and Roland left his workshop. He couldn't test his new idea in one of Xier's shops as the stores weren't in the business of selling magic swords. They mostly sold materials, scrolls, and alchemy products. He needed to find himself a shop that had a relation with an actual runesmith. These were weapon shops and armor shops, and they looked very similar to the ones a person could find in games. After some walking, he was now in front of one. It was one of the bigger shops in the city and there were already some adventurers inside looking over the items. The person that owned this was a runesmith that took the weaponsmith path. Getting a runesmith class was quite hard and he already knew this. Most of them would specialize in only one of the fields, either armors or weapons. The effort they would need to put to level up both would be astronomical. Still, some people like that existed and they were the true grandmasters of the craft. The shop was named Bomber's Weapons and it had a sword and axe symbol by the entrance. He was wearing his usual robe and covered most of his face as he didn't want to be spotted. The part of the store the regular customers were allowed to walk on was on the first floor. On this floor, you had various weapons of the regular variety. They were mostly made of steel or iron and you could even pick them up and examine them. The second floor wasn't accessible for just everyone. You had to be a silver grade adventurer or have some connections. On that floor, the more pricey enchanted weapons that were from the common grade and above were placed. Due to how much they cost, they were well protected and you had to jump through some hoops to even examine them. He wasn't here for those though, no. He walked over to where some of the rune enchanted items were, the ones with lesser runes. There were a lot of them around behind glass cases. A person just needed to call over one of the clerks to examine it or to purchase it. He on the other hand just wanted to examine them through the glass. He moved closer to one of those display cases. He saw some steel swords there, all of them were looking better than what he was able to produce. Steel axe of lesser sharpness. Steel dagger of lesser sharpness. He started looking through them. Most of them had the sharpness enchantment on it as it was one of the more popular ones. He needed to find an item with a rune that he didn't yet know and it didn't take him long to find one. Steel longsword of lesser scorching, there we go. Roland murmured to himself. That was one rune that he wasn't familiar with just yet. From his knowledge, he knew that this enchantment would imbue the weapon with flames. The flames wouldn't harm the weapon or the user. The magical fire would add a bit more damage to a person's attack, but it wasn't all that great as some people might think. He moved in closer as now was the time to carry out his dubious plan. He moved over to the glass case and was lucky enough that no one was close by. He carried out his plan by sticking his face as close to the glass as possible and then staring at the sword. Yes, he just came here to stare at the weapons. His debugging skill was activated and he could see the runic spell structure of the lesser scorching rune. He wouldn't be sketching a diagram here though, no. He was using one of his traits, mainly the knowledge retention one that he was blessed with. His memory wasn't perfect but he figured to give this a try. He already knew the runic structures after scribing so many schematics and spell scrolls. He didn't even need to remember all of the magical pathways. The most important thing were the separate components. He already knew the ones that were used for fire and flames. This lesser scorching rune had similar elements as the fire spells he was used to scribing. He remained there for 10 minutes just staring at the sword. Some of the workers gave him side glances as they didn't know what this person was doing. He had his head squished into the glass and was intently looking at one of the swords. Roland finally pulled his face away and quickly ran out of the store. This left the clerks even more surprised. The sword was there, so there was no stealing involved. The youth ran back to his workshop with haste and grabbed his paper and pencil. He quickly started drawing everything down. Within 15 minutes he had all of the components on the paper and only the traces remained. With the help of the drawing skill, he didn't even need a ruler to draw a straight line, so he finished up everything within half an hour. You have created the schematic for the lesser scorch rune low. He gained some experience for creating the schematic. It wasn't of the highest rating as he had made some mistakes here and there, but it was a working lesser scorching rune. With his debugging skill, he could easily increase it to the highest grade. Roland sat down while looking at the paper he just drew the schematic on and chuckled. He had just managed to borrow a yet unknown rune diagram for himself. He saved himself some small gold coins thanks to this, and it didn't seem that anyone noticed. He wanted to run back to that store and do it again. He knew that if he went through with that, someone could notice. He now had a way to get some free rune schematics, but he couldn't overdo it. He was scared that someone would notice him using an unknown skill, and if he went to jail they would have ways to identify it. Yet, no need to be hasty, Roland thought to himself. He was still stuck in this city for some years. He could slowly go to the weapon and armor shops and examine the wares. If he did it once or twice a week, no one should be any wiser. He couldn't do it again now, so he decided to move forward with one of his experiments. He would try making a Bronze Age sword. He would be using some pre-made items that he had bought previously. One of them was the mold box that went together with special sand that would go into it. The other thing he needed was a wooden replica of the sword he would be molding. Luckily he had done this strenuous task previously. He had gotten himself a piece of wood that was more or less a thicker plank. He first drew the shape of the sword on it. Roland went for a leaf-shaped sword design that would be on the shorter side. After drawing the shape on the wood, he had cut it into the rough shape, then filed it down to perfection. Now he just had to insert the sand into the mold along with the wooden sword replica. So he did, and luckily it left a nice sword imprint. He now needed to carve out a channel for the bronze to go in, that was at the handle part. This wasn't the first time he was doing this, as he had some practice with the paddle magic wands. This would take a lot more time though, as after the casting there would be a lot of grinding and polishing left to do. The mold that was in a wooden holder and had some latches on it to close it together. He also hammered in some nails to keep it tightly shut. The smelter was already running hot and the bronze was already in it. He wasn't doing his own mix of adding tin to copper, as he just got some working materials from another store. After everything was nicely melted, he took out the melting crucible with the heated metal and began pouring it into the small opening of the mold. Smoke started coming out, but luckily he didn't see anything spilling outside. The top of the wooden mold began catching on fire after it was filled up, but that wasn't a problem. The casting process was now over, and after the mold had cooled off it was time to open it. The latches and nails were removed and the inside was revealed. A very rough-looking piece of bronze covered in some sand was seen by him. After cleaning it up from the sand, the dreaded grinding process would begin. This would probably take him over a day to finish. Roland continued. His grinding stone and sandpaper were used. Luckily there was sandpaper in this world, otherwise this would take even longer. It was impossible to polish the blade without any blemishes, as the casting process in the mold just wasn't good enough. On the next day, he managed to get done with polishing and it was time to attach a wooden handle. He used the base wooden sword replica to draw out a handle on two smaller blocks of wood. He then used some tools to shave it down to size. Attaching it to the sword would be done with rivets. Bronze leaf-shaped sword intermediate. He looked at the shiny sword. He had polished the surface and he could very vaguely see his reflection in it. There were some scratches of the surface of the blade shaft from the sandpaper and grindstone left behind. If he wanted to get a highest rating, he would probably need to have a blade with no blemishes. This was enough. It was nice and sharp and was now ready for the rune crafting process. He grabbed a better steel hammer from the side. He still needed to get himself one that was at least made from dark steel in the future. There were even special ones with enchantments that boosted a smith's mana control. Though they cost an arm and a leg, as other runesmiths were unwilling to hand over good crafting tools to the competition. He pushed his magical energy into the hammer handle. It traveled upwards into the head and then went towards the face. It started glowing in blue light and crackled slightly the moment he delivered a blow to his bronze sword. The sound of gentle hammering resounded through the workshop and his work continued. He needed to take a couple of breaks and even meditated to get back his mana. Even with this, he wasn't able to inscribe the Lesser Scorch rune in one day. The whole rune crafting process took him a whole 3 days to finish, and he was left with a working product. Bronze leaf-shaped sword of Lesser Scorching Intermediate, High. Roland looked at his new creation. This was a lot harder to make than one of the previous paddles. This was also his first working weapon, though making it bronze probably meant that it wouldn't last for too long. He examined his reflection in the blade and then moved it up into the air before exclaiming, "Flame on!" He then injected mana through the wooden hilt. with the ethereal pathways skill in place this was finally a possibility. The runes in the blade shone and he could vaguely see the runic pathways lighting up as the magic structure was activated. A flame sword was thus created, which made Roland grin slightly. He was finally able to make a working weapon, even though it wasn't that usable, it was a proof of concept. He laughed out loud while forgetting himself and waving the fire sword around as a kid would when playing with a toy. His momentary outburst of happiness was interrupted the moment someone called out to him from the back. "Hey, are you really just a regular blacksmith?" He turned around and saw Helsi standing there and looking at his runic sword. She was out on adventures, so he didn't bother hiding his rune crafting. He also was so focused on it that he didn't notice the girl's return. "How long were you standing there?" "Oh, about an hour, you seemed busy so I didn't want to bother you." She smiled while looking at the taller youth that still had a flaming sword in his hand. "But I locked the door." He looked to the door and it was still closed. "Oh, yeah. It was locked, so I climbed through the opened window. Climbing is nothing for a scout." Helsi grinned as if she did well. She had climbed through the second-floor window that he left open for some ventilation. It was still day, so he also didn't leave any traps for thieves behind. "That's not the important thing, how did you do that?" Helsi pointed at the glowing sword that Roland finally turned off. Her eyes were sparkling as if she was a kid in a candy store. Now he needed to explain himself to his own assistant and hope that she wouldn't spread this information around. He already was starting to get a headache. Chapter 45 Nosy Assistant. Roland was in a bind. He was looking at a small half-gnome girl shaking her body side to side. She was looking at him with those large orbs that she called eyes. The young girl had climbed through an open window and seen him rune crafting. "Hey, how did you do that? That's an enchanted sword for sure." "You can enchant swords? Are you an enchant smith?" "I knew it, you lied about your age. You have to be tier 2 for that." The girl had come to the conclusion that he was at least an enchant smith. She wasn't able to distinguish between enchanting and rune smithing. This wasn't the problem though, his secret that he somewhat wanted to keep hidden from others was now revealed. "I'm not old, you idiot, and this isn't a regular enchanted sword." To be honest, Roland was a bit tired of hiding here in this town. He had to wear that black robe and had to avoid people. He feared that either assassins would find him or someone related to his noble house would recognize him. If they reported it to his father, he would probably get yanked back home. Though at this point he had already used up 2 class slots, there wasn't really a way for him to go back to being a soldier. At most his dear father would probably stick him in the army's smithy to make magical swords for them. Roland wasn't sure how forceful he would be in his methods, maybe he was overthinking it and he would be fine. Still, he was paranoid after the first assassination attempt and now there was even a second one. For now, he looked at the cute girl that was stomping her little feet on the ground. "Who are you calling an idiot? You are the idiot, you idiot." The girl puffed out her cheeks and started acting out by shaking her hands around widely. Helsi was behaving below her age bracket, but he wasn't sure. Not like he knew many 17-year-olds. The only reference to them were his old party members. He wasn't that good with people, so this was giving him a headache. "I'm going to have a brain aneurysm." "An aneurysm? Is that an enchantment?" The pouting girl tipped her head to the side and asked, not really knowing what Roland was talking about. The younger male placed the freshly made runic sword on his workbench. He didn't have time to enjoy his new creation. He even wanted to try inscribing some pre-made steel weapons to then sell them to his boss. Now on the other hand he had this to worry about. He looked at the not-so-smart-looking girl and raised his eyebrow. Was he worrying too much? Would anyone even believe what she was saying? Who would she even give this information to? She was only a simple adventurer with no real pull in this city. He could also try a different approach by just asking her to stay quiet about this. He didn't feel like this girl had an ulterior motive. "Hey Helsi, can I ask you something?" Sure." She nodded. Do you think a tier 2 enchantsmith that is close to 13 years old is a common thing? The girl looked at Roland, not really sure where he was going with this question. She was someone that had just recently started her adventuring. Her life was mostly spent at the orphanage with the church or at the inn. This didn't mean that she was ignorant of her environment, she had already gone through some experience. 13-year-old tier 2 enchantsmith, probably not. That's right. And do you know what people do to uncommon things? Helsi rubbed her chin and then pointed at Roland. They want to have it. Oh. She realized where Roland was going with it and quickly shouted. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. Your secret is safe with me. Roland blinked. Would it be that easy? There were ways of making people talk even if they didn't want to. He wasn't sure, but Helsi might have already signed a contract with his company. The gnome manager might have had foresight to sign something like a non-disclosure agreement. Not like he could do anything about this now though, he wouldn't actually hurt the girl. She wasn't strong but didn't seem like a liar or someone that gave away other people's secrets. Hey! You can trust me. She trailed off at the end while glancing at the bronze sword that he made. Her eyes were speaking for themselves and he knew what this meant. He wanted to smack her head a bit, but he knew that if you wanted something you needed to either pay or work for it. If you stay quiet about it, I'll enchant your sword. He needed to make a trade. The girl was quite honorable from what he knew. If he did something for her, she would probably feel obliged to keep quiet. Enchanted and runic weapons were really costly and he knew that Helsi was quite poor. She would probably need to scrape by a lot before she could afford a weapon like that. He wanted to offer putting runic inscriptions on her arrows at first, but that wouldn't be quite possible yet. His rune crafting skill would need to be leveled up further. From what he saw, the runic structures were getting smaller the further he leveled his skill up. He theorized that when he got it to about level 7, he would be able to fit lesser runes on them. Common ones were out of the question, he would probably only be able to do that after achieving a tier 2 class. An enchanted sword. The girl took a step back. She knew well that magic weapons were what a true adventurer desired. It was also a sign of wealth and prosperity. Only when you started wearing magical armor and weapons could you call yourself a true adventurer. It was a sign of prestige and a first step towards the top. Enchanted armor, enchanted bow. Roland raised an eyebrow as he saw the girl mumbling to herself. He could have sworn that she even started drooling for a while. He had underestimated how poor Helsi actually was. Her life consisted of scraping by. She didn't even have a large silver coin in her pouch. She was more or less just living day to day and spending whatever she earned. Whenever she came here she would eat with him, from the rations that the company supplied to save. Stop, an enchanted sword is the most I can do for now. I'm still just an apprentice, I never even tried enchanting a bow either. He didn't even have any bow enchantments. Making a sharp bow or one that started flaming wouldn't really work. You actually needed to enchant the arrows and not the bow to empower them with magic. A good enchantment for a bow was something that made it lighter to pull, silent or hard to break. There were some powerful runes that could produce a bow that didn't need arrows and exchanged them for magical ones. This was something far too advanced for someone like him though. He also couldn't make the superior runic weapons that had mana stones in them either. Roland theorized that he might be able to learn that skill from a skill book like the one the manager gave him. He wasn't sure if it was a tier 2 or tier 3 skill though, probably at most he could get a basic version of it. This would probably lengthen the crafting process extensively. The girl looked a bit saddened by the fact that she wouldn't be getting an enchanted bow. Still, she recovered quickly while pulling out her short sword. She was of a smaller stature compared to a human, so this was almost a long sword to her. Roland looked at the sword to identify it. Considering he was a blacksmith now, he was able to identify basic weapons made from regular metals. He had a whole list of various stats now, he couldn't see some of the subcategories quite yet though. For instance, the damage type that showed up. If he leveled up his skills he would be able to see a letter next to it, ranging from F to S. The information varied, the sharpness was indicated by a percentage but other statics could be counted by a letter or some kind of word instead. It was quite confusing and there was no uniform grading system there. Roland looked over the short sword, it was slightly banged up. If the weapon's sharpness went below 40%, the weapon would get a dull debuff. The damage it could output would also go down. At 0% it would lose its slashing damage and turn to blunt damage that was lower. Helsi looked at the taller youth that was eyeing her short sword strangely. He waved it around and even poked it with his finger a bit. His eyebrows went from squinting to furrowing and he even started to scoff while examining the short sword. Is it that bad? The girl was slightly disheartened that the weapon she had spent a large chunk of her coins on was getting scrutinized. This in her bow was the only thing she could afford. She was already saving a bit on the arrows as Roland was making them almost for free. She only needed to supply the raw materials like the iron or steel stocks and the pre-made arrow quills. Bad? No, it's fine, but it needs some sharpening. What kind of enchantment would you like to put on it? Mind you, I can only put lesser ones on this and it will probably take over a week or two to make. How about a sharpness one? Those are quite popular. Roland replied, hoping that she would go for the easy sharpness rune. He wasn't quite sure what the adventurers liked to have on their enchanted swords. The sharpness enchantment when activated didn't actually change the sword's structure. Instead, it surrounded the blade part with a thin layer of mana that smoothed things out and made it sharper. After mana stopped being injected, the blade went back to being a regular piece of metal. This type of enchantment drained mana slowly by the second. It was similar to the Scorching Rune and differed from the spell runes that took a chunk of a user's mana when activated. What kind of enchantment? I can choose. The girl's big eyes sparkled and she started to bounce about the room. This also made Roland's eyes momentarily wander down to a certain bouncy body part. He quickly shook his head. The hormones in this body were starting to make things difficult for the old man on the inside. After Helsi posed the question, he felt like he had made a big mistake. He probably should have taken the blade and inscribed the rune of his choosing. Now he left the choice up to a girl that was in a perpetual state of poverty. Would she go for the cheapest option when someone offered something for free? Enchantment, it must be one of those sword attacks. The sharpness enchantment isn't even that good. She crossed her hands over her chest and started nodding. Apparently, she wanted something else, an attack-type enchantment. Just like mages had magic spells like the fire arrow spell that he frequently used. There were special skills and magical attacks that magical warriors utilized. These magical skills like the scorching ability were mostly something from the mana warrior's repertoire. It was also a tier 1 class, similar to the mana scribe class. The Scorching enchantment was a lesser version of the Flame Sword enchantment that was accessible for a Tier 2 Flame Warrior. Similar to the Tier 2 Elemental Mage variants, the magical warriors specialized in their own set of elements. Scorching only made the blade heat up and produce a flame. It wasn't much better than having a torch. The Tier 2 version actually heated it up to the point of letting the user cut and scorch monster flesh. Then a Tier 3 version that was called the Blazing Sword enchantment would even allow the user to melt through other metals. When it came to Tier 1 mana warrior skills that could be put on swords, there were two main ones. The mana slash and the mana thrust. The first one produced a sharp condensed blade of blue mana that could be used as a ranged attack. The other produced a similar effect just with the thrusting motion and would punch a hole in the enemy from further away. I want a mana slash enchantment, but maybe the thrust is better. The girl did actually want one of those. This meant that he would need to make a visit to one of the weapon shops and get it. He could also just put a mana arrow spell on it instead. But such spells didn't really work well with warriors' specialized movements. They worked best with things like the wands he made. Aiming magic with heavy weapons was less than optimal. The mana slash attack could be easily timed and activated during a fight. This made it slightly similar to the impact rune, but it delivered magic damage, which sometimes was a must to beat some opponents. The impact rune only increased the weight of your weapon but didn't add any magical properties. There were some monsters out there that were immune to physical attacks. Thus this type of enchantment was popular with the warriors that couldn't become a magic swordsman. These mana attacks also used up less MP than magic spells used by mages. This was mostly due to having a lower range of attack. The mana slash would travel 10 meters at most and the thrust went a little further. I have my arrows and bow, so the close-ranged mana slash will probably be better. Helsi thought out loud while rubbing her chin. She was looking at her short sword that she retrieved from Roland. She performed some slashes and thrusts before coming to a decision. The mana slash would be the one that she would get. Mana slash? I don't really know that one. The moment Roland said that, Helsi's head dropped a bit along with her shoulders. But I can learn to make it, you'll just have to wait a bit. She quickly raised her head up after hearing his words, her eyes glittered and she jumped forward. Roland was surprised, the girl was really quick as she gave him a big hug. He wasn't really used to shows of affection, so both his hands were hovering in the air as he wasn't sure what to do with them. You're the best, Roland, I'll be sure to cook you up something great. Roland coughed a bit into his hand after the two separated. Various thoughts were going through his head, mostly ones that were affected by his teenage hormones. The girl looked up to the youth and noticed him acting strange. This brought a little smile on her face. So, you can make that kind of face? She giggled to herself while Roland turned around. He wasn't sure what kind of face he was making, but he felt defeated after getting teased by a kid. I don't know what you are talking about, shouldn't you be working? Helsi gave Roland a salute before skipping to the side. He actually had a stove where the girl could cook in the warehouse portion. It was far enough from the smelter and the anvil so that no hot metal or iron shavings got into the food. Roland gave out a sigh before grabbing a sword from the side. It was a pre-made product that he got from his company. With Helsi already knowing his true skills, he could just work normally. This might have actually been a good thing, now he didn't need to hide his class from his assistant. The sword he would be crafting a rune on was a regular steel longsword. He would be adding a basic sharpness rune on it. It would probably take him a while to do this, after which he could go to one of the stores to borrow a mana/schematic. He had a lot of work on his hands, and now even an eager half-gnome that would probably bug him for the item he promised her. Chapter 46 Trouble Brewing. A young man about the age of 20 was walking through the forest. He was holding onto a piece of parchment that had a drawing on it. He had been going through the instructions on this piece of paper towards a supposed meet-up point. Is that the tree? There was a large dead tree in the middle of nowhere. The grass around here was thin and lacked color. The man walked up to it and pulled out a white envelope. The envelope was sealed by a red seal that had a certain insignia on it. The crest on it had a knight on a horse that was standing up on it, and it was in the shape of a shield. The man moved forward and looked at the ugly-looking tree. He started feeling out the wide trunk with his fingers and finally found what he was looking for. Here it is. He injected mana while pushing his fingers into a certain spot. The dark trunk lit up and he could see some intricate runic symbols showing. The man's hands started shaking slightly as he had a bad premonition. He looked to the piece of paper and moistened up his lips before speaking out. Master of the Abyss, I abandon myself wholly to thy power. You are the darkness behind and beneath the shadows. You are the absence of air that awaits at the bottom of every breath. The man continued to read the lengthy chant. The more words he said, the more the dead tree reacted to his presence, and when he finished it started humming. He took a step back, afraid that he had messed up. Just as he was about to retreat back out of fright, the tree's wide trunk started opening. A previously unseen hole revealed itself as the branches and bark shifted. The man looked at the head-sized hole and then quickly threw the letter in. The piece of paper that he was previously reading caught on fire the moment he did. He tossed it to the side while it burned in a dark flame. Nothing was left of the parchment but ashes. The hole that he threw the parchment in sealed itself up almost instantly after the message was delivered. The man quickly turned away and started running. He was given a set of instructions to deliver this letter. He had no idea what was in it or who the people behind this strange tree were. From the sound of it, they were worshippers of some kind of evil god, which one he had no idea as there were more than one. He wouldn't remain here for the worshippers of this god to return. He had gotten the letter from a noble's knight. He knew to what house he belonged to. If the noble behind this knight was an evil god worshipper, it would be better to leave this area. Nothing ever good came from involving yourself with people like that. There were even fallen cities that were run over by demons. People would make contracts with these demonic beings to gain power. People could achieve special prestige classes as a boon. These classes mostly demanded bloody sacrifices, and some people possessing them would be turned into monsters in human form. The power they possessed was very real, which in turn corrupted them to turn to that side. The man sped up, his feet moved silently through the night. The forest was quiet and he couldn't even hear any animals or monsters around him. There was something odd about this. He was someone experienced. When he was going this way he could clearly feel hidden beings, but now there was nothing. It was as if they vanished into thin air. He continued running, but there was a problem. The path that he had marked for his return was gone. He made sure to nick the trees here and there so that he wouldn't be lost. He stopped and looked around. The howling winds pushed the tree branches around that looked like sharp claws in the moonlight. The man began sweating as he felt that he was in danger. This wasn't right, he thought, and bolted forward. He needed to get out of here as fast as he could. He ran and his stamina counter continued to drop fast. He was someone at the tier 2 class and had stamina to spare. What the? He pushed through some bushes and saw something odd. The same tree that he had placed the letter in was there out in the clearing. Was he running around in circles this whole time? Something was off. He knew that he didn't have such a bad sense of direction. He tried finding the place that he came through the first time and started running again. There were still no signs of his old path as before. And no, how is this possible? After another hour of running he ended up at the large dead tree once again. It was as if it was mocking him. He looked up into the night sky and noticed another thing. The moons didn't seem to be changing. He had already spent 2 hours in this forest, but the night wasn't passing. It should be 4 in the morning now, but it looked like time had frozen. His eyes went bloodshot as the nightmare continued. He continuously ran through the forest trying to find his way home. 1 day, 2 days, and then a whole week had passed, but he still ended up by the tree. He started cutting the tree in a fit of rage, but whenever he left and came back it was as if nothing happened. No matter how much damage he delivered to the tree, when he came back it was as if he was never there, to begin with. When he was his second week into this nightmare, something suddenly happened. He looked down at his chest. He moved his trembling hand to the right side and felt horrible pain. It was as if someone was stabbing something sharp right through his heart. Ah, did you have to do that? He didn't even fully fall to the curse. The man blinked and the scenery changed slightly. He was still next to the dead tree, but he wasn't alone. This time around he noticed 2 people standing over him while he was down on the ground. One of the people was pushing a glowing red dagger through his chest where his heart was. He couldn't really make out their facial features as his life soon faded and he dropped dead. "We don't have time for this." The man that was holding the knife scoffed at the person next to him. From their figures, you could make out that the one with the dagger was a man and the other person was a woman. The dagger that was plunged into the dead man's chest started glowing even more as it got pulled out. The veins in his body started glowing bright orange and then turned to red. The deep wound where the heart was started pulsating in the same color and glowing brightly. "Ooh, I love this part." The woman laughed while looking at the twitching body. The skin sizzled and started fading away, and soon the whole body burned away into ashes. Nothing besides the man's clothes and a certain item was left behind. The man moved his hand into the spot where the dead man's heart was and he pulled out a blood-colored crystal. "So shiny, but it's only a tier 2, not really worth using. Stop fooling around and get the letter, we had spent too much time here already." The man scoffed while removing the man's gear from the ground. He was sure to wipe away all the traces while the woman moved over to the tree. She placed her hand on the trunk but didn't recite the chant. The tree opened up in a similar fashion to reveal the letter on the inside. Got it. She waved at her partner that was already moving away from the scene of the crime. Soon both of them vanished into the night. What was left of the man were only his ashes that would soon become fertilizer for the grass and plants. Life continued, and at the dawn of the next day, Roland was looking over his first creation. Sharp runic steel longsword intermediate, high. He had inscribed the sharpness rune on the first longsword that he received. He didn't put his red comet calling card on this item. It didn't feel right unless he created everything himself. He also didn't want his mark being associated with anything else than high and highest graded items. The materials for the runic scrolls didn't matter that much as they were one use only. But when it came to swords, he didn't want them to be anything less than high. He could very well sell this item without his calling card, so it didn't matter that much. He took the sword for a test run by activating the rune. The sword started to faint glow in blue light and the inscribed rune started glowing. He examined it closely and could feel his MP slowly going down while the magic effect was active. He placed the sword that he upgraded into a magical one into a nice box and then tied it together with some string. He would earn some nice cash by selling this thing, and he didn't actually lose any money while making it. The company provided the blade and they also provided the crafting hammer. The only thing he needed to put into this was his time and mana. Helsi, could you take this and carry it back to Xier's Magic Emporium? The girl peeked her head into the workshop and grabbed the box with the sword inside. She looked over it for a moment before placing it into her own spatial bag. So, will you be making my sword now? She leaned over closer to Roland and gave his side a poke with her finger. His body reacted in an odd fashion as he twitched uncontrollably. It had taken him 5 days to finish this product. Making runic inscriptions on steel weapons was a lot harder than on bronze. This also meant that his assistant bothered him every day for the whole week. She was clearly the impatient type, but a promise was a promise. Yeah. I'll be making yours next, I just need to go to the store to go get something. The girl smiled brightly after hearing that and finally left while carrying his first store-worthy weapon. Roland gave out a sigh and put on his robe, the one he used to hide his appearance. He didn't have time to scout out the next schematic. This time around he would have to remember a more difficult one. It was for the mana/rune that allowed other people to use a mana warrior's skill. Wish I had time to go make that bike. He thought to himself while going towards his next destination. He was worried about standing out, so he decided to go to a different weapon shop this time around. This one was quite a distance away from his workshop though, so it took him a while to walk there. On the inside it had a similar layout to the other shop he was in before. The difference was that instead of the better items being upstairs, they were down in the lower levels instead. He walked around it and was lucky enough to discover a blade with the enchantment he was looking for. There were some guards and clerks loitering around as always. The glass case this weapon was placed in was a bit more problematic. In the other store, the case was in a more secluded spot. This one was hanged out for everyone to see along with some other weapons. He couldn't just stand there for 10 minutes with his face pressed against the glass case. There were too many people around. He moved forward, the furthest away that he could while being able to activate his debugging skill. Inconspicuous or not, he needed to get this crafting schematic somehow. He walked and glanced, but there were other people there and they continued to walk around. Sometimes they blocked the view, sometimes a worker came over and broke his concentration. He was also standing too far away and couldn't see well. After 15 minutes of bumbling about, he backed away and went outside the store. This isn't working, maybe I'll make some notes on the way and then try recreating it back at my workshop. He thought to himself while taking out some rough paper. He started thinking back to the rune layout and started scribbling down what he remembered. He looked at the finished product and furrowed his brows, but before he could scoff even more he felt a tapping on his shoulder. "What are you doing?" "Who, what?" He turned around and saw a familiar-looking girl, it was his assistant Helsi. "What are you doing here? Did you follow me?" "Of course. You said you were going to enchant my sword and get some materials. I'm here to help." She smiled. She was a scout and a tracker, so following Roland's trail with one of her skills was quite easy. While using such a skill, she had a nice trail of his footprints to follow that glowed. "You really want to get that enchantment, don't you?" She just nodded while looking at him. Roland just wanted to facepalm. He didn't even get the rune schematics, and now she was even here. There were just too many people inside looking around. Maybe he needed to find another store or give up. He then looked to Helsi, who was just humming to herself some kind of tune. He then got a not so good idea. "Hey, Helsi." He walked up to the girl and then started whispering his plan into her ear. The girl just looked at him and nodded, not really sure where he was going with it. Back inside the store, Roland walked back to where the sword was hanging and went back to work. This time around he got a lot closer and stopped moving. There were still other people here, but the moment someone else moved to the larger display case, they were blocked by a cute-looking half-gnome girl. "Hey, have you heard about Our Lady and Savior Goddess Solaria?" The person looked at the girl while flinching and instantly backed away. The zealots around the city were well known, so most people didn't like talking to them. This was more or less the plan that Roland hastily came up with. While he was trying to remember the schematic, Helsi would try to somehow get the people away. She just needed to stall them for 10 minutes or get their attention away from him. The Solaria bit was just one of the easiest ways of keeping people away from you. It would also get you removed from the store sooner or later, as store owners didn't allow such things inside. The girl switched it up, but actually shoulder tackling one person that started getting too close to where Roland was. She also started singing and dancing, which finally brought the store clerk over to check the situation. She was finally thrown out of the store, but it was enough time for Roland to go through the whole runic diagram in his head. With the previously drawn notes, he was sure that he would be able to draw a working schematic. Helsi was really a good worker when her enchanted sword was on the line. Roland just needed to tell her a half-truth. He explained that he needed to examine the sword from the store that had her enchantment on it for some reference. The people were getting in his way and he couldn't concentrate. She was very eager to help after the explanation. The two were now back at the workshop. Helsi handed Roland a bag of coins that was filled with gold and silver. This was part of his earnings from the past month, and it looked like the sword that he just made was also counted in. "Okay Helsi, I need to concentrate now, so you are free to go. I should have your sword ready within a week. You can take one of those in the meantime, though they aren't really that good." In the corner of the workshop were some steel swords that were meant for runic enchanting. He would lend her one of them, but she would need to return it. He was able to repair swords like that, but not that confident in making one at the same intermediate rank. Roland's life as a runic blacksmith continued, and he was slowly building up his monetary empire. He spent most of his time focusing on enhancing the pre-made swords that his company was giving him and training his rune craft. He didn't even need to bother with the scribing skill that wasn't even leveling up. His boss even allowed him to make the switch, as the swords would bring in more money. So the days continued. Soon they turned into weeks and then into months. His life slowly continued without much happening until about the 1.5-year mark, which brought some changes. Chapter 47 Progress. A tall young man of about 183 centimeters of height was standing next to a large anvil. He was wearing a cotton shirt and had a large thick blacksmith's apron over it. The shirt was quite loose, which allowed for more airflow and better ventilation. Still, there was some sweat forming on his brow. His build wasn't very bulky, but you could see quite a lot of tone on his arms and chest. It looked like the youth's body didn't have a chance to build enough muscle to go with his growth spurt. The youth was standing in a blacksmith's workshop and had a flat piece of steel in his hand. It was already heated up and red after he took it out of his forge. This was obviously the material he was working on. He placed it on the anvil and started delivering hard hammer blows to it. The piece of steel started to slowly take shape. The blows were delivered consistently over the whole length at high precision. His hand didn't shake and he never missed the correct spot. From time to time you would see his hands stopping and an ethereal glow filling his eyes, which after the hammering process continued. The previously angular piece of metal started getting stretched out. There was a lot of back and forth in this forging process. The piece of metal needed to be reheated multiple times and hammered into the correct blade shape. Soon it was noticeable that the young smith was making a long-bladed weapon. There was nothing more to it, just consistent hammer strikes were enough to get the piece of metal into a sword shape. One end was pointed while the other one was left smaller for the handle and the cross guard. This end was called the tang and he needed to make it thinner at the end to fit it through the pommel. Before the cross guard and pommel would be made, the rough-looking sword needed a lot of grinding. The whole piece of metal needed to be filed down and sharpened to the utmost perfection before the next process. There were no power tools in this world, but the youth had something similar. It allowed him to make the process of polishing and grinding faster but at a small cost. After that task was finished, the hammering of a piece of steel that would be the crossguard started. The shape that was hammered looked cruciform at a slight bent that would be going outwards from the sword grip. The young blacksmith punched a hole through the middle that would be used to attach the crossguard to the blade. He made sure to first test if it fit before continuing with the hammering so that it would take the desired shape. After the blade and the crossguard were ready, only the pommel remained. It would be placed below the grip and would have a circular shape. After this was done, the process of normalizing the steel remained. Forging created stresses and normalizing relieved that stresses. After completing that process, he only needed to attach all the parts and polish everything to perfection. Without drills in this world, the swords were held in place by a certain technique that was called peening. This was done by hammering the steel part that was poking out through the hollow pommel. Thanks to this, the sword hilt wouldn't slip anymore and everything would be nice and tight. If he managed to create a drill, he could just attach the round sword pommel by just screwing it into place. After some time, the youth was left with a working product. He looked at it while nodding, but this wasn't over yet. He grabbed another hammer from the side. This one looked different from the rest and it had a strange runic pattern on the face side. The process of rune crafting had started. The youth hammered away, this time with much less force. The strikes were slow and precise, and each time one landed, a part of a rune was formed. This process took almost as long as the whole forging did. The youth had a couple of accessories helping him out with managing his mana, so it sped things up a bit. Still, it took him a week to get this sword done. This was already a big improvement considering that he was creating a special kind of rune. An older-looking Roland glanced at the stats of his creation. He was slightly disheartened that he only managed to make an intermediate-rank steel sword. Though his rune crafting had taken off and he was now able to produce the highest-tier runes of the lesser rank. This was the culmination of the last 1.5 years of work. A weapon with a double rune inscription. He had managed to take the two popular runes of Mana Slash and Mana Thrust and combine it into an interchangeable spell structure. The trick to using this kind of weapon was with the user's mana control. It took some time to learn, but with time a person would be able to interchange between the two skills. This wasn't a new skill but depended on the rune schematic. The biggest problem was in planning and producing a working dual rune that could house two spells at once. There were a couple of techniques that a runesmith could work with here. The one he used required the runes to be similar and share most of their components. Both Mana Slash and Mana Thrust were similar in their runic spell structure. He just needed to combine them and connect them in the right place so that they could be activated separately. The activation nodes for each one were in a slightly different place. The user would need to remember where exactly and be able to correctly inject their mana there. This was the biggest weakness of this design, as it was troublesome for people that didn't possess any mana-related skills. They would find it hard to control such items, which lowered the market value a bit. Another way to do it would be to have separate moving parts, for instance, a sort of movable ring. The user could then turn it around and connect the rune they wanted to use. With such a design there was no need for mana control. He placed the finished sword to the side and examined his skills and stats. he had made some progress but he wasn't quite there yet. Name: Roland Arden L69. Classes: T1 Mage L25 Secondary, T1 Runic Monoscribe L25X, T1 Runic Blacksmith L19 Main. HP: 700/700, MP: 338/2538, SP: 326/1003. Strength: 53, Agility: 38, Dexterity: 80, Vitality: 52, Endurance: 60, Intelligence: 114, Willpower: 100, Charisma: 16, Luck: 8. His physical stats besides agility had increased by quite a bit. This class was one of the better ones if it came to that. His previous runic scribe class didn't really give him anything besides intelligence, dexterity, and willpower. The runic blacksmith class was endurance and strength reliant, so he saw a big increase in those two skills as well as in his health. It was also a runic variant, so it increased his willpower and intelligence by a large margin. Though it was heavier on the willpower, probably due to the rune smithing skill that required a lot of concentration. With his increased stats he could actually produce this type of combination rune in less than a week. Previously he had a hard time with easier runes on bronze materials. He had indeed made a lot of progress this past year. He was now an actual blacksmith. His basic smithing skills were all close to maxing out. Luckily he had the schematic trick so his level could keep up with his skills. Still, he was slowly reaching an impasse. His leveling was now at an all-time low and he was already running low on schematics. Without them, he would probably need another 2 years of crafting to max his level out. Maybe I should give the adventuring gig a try again, he thought to himself while giving out a sigh. This brought back a memory of a certain person that wasn't here anymore. Are you done? Can I make my delivery? A high-pitched voice called out to Roland. It came from outside the workshop that was closed. He didn't want people walking in on him when he was busy with his work. Yeah, give me a moment. The moment he was done with this sword he had massaged the person responsible for transport. He did this thanks to a small magical device that worked similar to a pager. It looked like a little bell, but when rung another exact copy of this bell would ring. Thus a person on the other end would then know that it was time to pick up the goods. He wasn't giving away the sword that he just made. He was still just rune crafting on the pre-made weapons that the company was sending him. The better made items that he was still testing were for himself. Roland grabbed a prepared parcel from the side. He then slid it through a smaller opening in his entrance door. The person on the other side was an alchemy apprentice. The same person that picked Roland up from prison over a year ago. He just grabbed the package with a different sword that Roland had made and walked away. Roland and this youth didn't really talk that much with each other. The halfling youth was still mad that he needed to be an errand boy. The person that used to do this had quit a couple of months ago. Roland closed the latch and walked back to his room. It was cluttered with his notes and rune schematics. Since his old assistant decided to finally leave for a city with a dungeon in it. Yes, Helsi had left Edelgard about 2 months ago and he was still getting used to living in more silence again. She did leave him a gift before going away, but something like that wouldn't be mentioned to anyone else. It was quite the experience, but waking up to a farewell note ruined the ending. Not like he blamed her for anything. Both of them had clearly different life goals. He wanted to stay in one place and practice his crafting. In the near future, he wanted to open his own shop and live a quiet life. Helsi on the other hand wanted to adventure. She only stayed in the city due to a lack of funds and equipment. When the time was right she began her journey towards a place that had a dungeon near it. This was the best option for an aspiring adventurer. There wasn't much of that in this city. Dungeons and adventuring, hey! He said while grabbing one of the more clean-looking mugs. After each successful craft, he liked to drink some hot black tea. It tasted similar to Earl Grey tea from his old world and went down well with some honey. He looked at some old banged-up iron swords that were tossed in the corner. While the girl was still here, he did act as a sparring partner. His battle skills did go up a bit from that. Even though he didn't see adventuring as anything else than a means to an end. He knew that gaining levels and getting stronger would help him out in this life. He didn't feel like venturing deeper into the monster-infested forest would be a good idea though. He always kept to the edges of it. The hobgoblin he met was already a big surprise. There were tier 2 and probably some tier 3 monsters in there. Luckily they didn't venture out of the forest. The creatures were wary of the humans living behind the large stone walls. They also had no leader to gather them up against a common enemy. Unless the beasts caused trouble outside the forest areas, the city lord or the guild wouldn't get involved. Sometimes large-scale eradication missions took place to thin the population. It wasn't quite time for that just yet. After finishing up the tea, he walked over to a large metallic box. It had a handle, and after opening it up, a small wave of chilled air hit his face. This was his version of a refrigerator that he came up with. It was more or less a big black box made of iron with a latch on it. Inside, a person could see some runic inscriptions of similar-looking runes. These were runes that had the job of chilling the inside of this large box. The runes didn't use up much mana, as they didn't even reach freezing temperatures. Compared to something like a frozen arrow spell, they didn't really need much mana to run. Regretfully, Roland wasn't able to integrate mana stones into the construction quite yet. Instead, he needed to periodically charge the magic refrigerator with his own mana. It was sealed tightly, so as long as the chilly air didn't escape, he didn't need to recharge it that much. This wasn't the only improvement to his shop. He had thought about improving some of his tools with a more modern outlook. What did the modern smiths from his old world have that these didn't? It was mainly power tools, things like drills that were used instead of punches for holes. He had managed to emulate one of those tools, mainly an automatic grinder. He would have liked to make a belt grinder, but he went with an easier option. He just modified the foot-powered grindstone to be powered with runes. The speed it could reach with the added rune was far greater than before and sped up the process of grinding exponentially. The downside was the use of mana, but luckily it didn't burn that much of it down when activated. The rune wasn't very intricate and didn't require that much force, as it just needed to spin the wheel around. He also hoped to improve on the design in the future when he got the mana stone problem sorted out. He had gotten more info about the later runesmith skills, and he had also bought a skill book that cost him almost half a year's worth of work. The one he bought had the name Basic Rune Compression. Just as its name stated, it was a skill that allowed a user to condense their runes into smaller ones without losing any power. Besides this purchased skill, he also gained some with his own class naturally. One of them he even used during the crafting of his sword, and it was called Runic Blacksmith's Eyes. It allowed him to see cracks and fissures in the items that he crafted in real time. With it, he had an idea where to deliver his next hammer strike to fix a broken structure during the creation procedure. It was also an enhanced version of a similar skill that was called Blacksmith's Eyes and helped him guide his runic inscription during the rune crafting process. Only when he got that skill was he able to break through from high into the highest grade. Another skill was called Blacksmith's Heat Sense, and it was used to help a smith with measuring the right heat. Thanks to this, he always knew when the metal was ready for normalizing or for hammering. These were all nice and helpful skills, but the one he really wanted to find was related to mana stones. He had asked the gnome manager about it, but apparently, the runesmiths kept that one a secret. There were very few skill books out there with it, and it cost a lot more than what he was making. The only way the gnome would sponsor that skill for him was through a contract extension. There was also the way of earning skills yourself or unlocking it with your class. He could very well receive it the moment he reached the tier 2 crafting class of his choice or down the line. There was no reason to put himself in debt quite yet. He was still young and could already produce weapons above most regular runesmiths. All thanks to those schematics and his debugging skill that showed him the way. The only real problem at this point was producing common grade equipment. Even with his improved level and skills, it wasn't that easy. There was also the problem with the materials. Regular steel weapons degraded really fast with any runes above the lesser grade. The natural step up would be deep iron and deep steel that was an alloy from it. What came with better material were higher costs and increased difficulty in rune crafting. He glanced at his skills once more before thinking about the future. Debugger L6, Circuitry L7, Tinkerer L8, Identify L8, Basic Mana Shaping L9, Basic Mana Regulation L9, Mana Sense L9, Basic Rune Mastery L9, Basic Rune Scribing L9, Basic Smithing Mastery L8, Basic Rune Craft L7, Runic Blacksmith Size L5, Blacksmith's Heat Sense L6, Basic Rune Compression L3, Ethereal Pathways L6. He received the Heat Sense skill at level 7 and the Blacksmith Size skill at level 13. He had been a blacksmith for about 2 years now. His progress was slightly faster than of other smiths but not by that much. The basic skills leveled up fairly quickly. He mostly suffered by having too many skills to focus on. Rune crafting did keep him away from regular smithing. He felt that in a year or two he should have all these skills maxed and ready for the Tier 2 class change. The more interesting things were his debugger, circuitry, and tinkerer skills that he had from day one. They had also leveled up. The tinkerer won the most as he was probably gaining experience to it thanks to smithing. The other two probably ranked up thanks to rune crafting or rune scribing. It took quite a long time to level them up though, almost a whole 4 years to be exact. He figured that the runes he was working on might have been too low leveled for these skills to gain much experience. Maybe if I focus on runic compression I'll be able to squeeze some common runes on the swords so that they don't melt after 5 uses. He rubbed his chin before grabbing his coat. He didn't find much leftover food in his runic refrigerators so he had to go do some shopping. No more assistant meant that he was back to dining at the pubs and inns. He left his workshop with a layer of clothes. It was winter this season and it was quite chilly outside. The small feet imprints of the halfling youth were barely visible as it had started to snow. Maybe when my contract runs out I could go to a city with less snow and rain. He thought to himself while walking, the frosty air making him push a shawl up towards his mouth as he hid his face. The city was silent, nothing had occurred for the past year and a half. Roland was slowly getting used to this kind of life but if it would continue as such no one knew. Chapter 48 Thinking Back and New Discoveries. The sound of distant barking broke the silence of the night. It was faintly noticeable between the howling wind that rattled the uneven windows in Roland's room. The light from his candle flickered as it danced around. The young man was lying down on his bed. Roland was holding both his hands behind his head and looking at the ceiling. He was spacing out while thinking about the future. He had already spent almost 10 years in this foreign world and he still felt like he didn't belong here. He thought back to the day that he had arrived. He was confused and scared. The people in his so-called new home were cold and distant. The original Roland was a 5-year-old child and didn't know much about the world. His old memories had already faded into obscurity and he wasn't sure why his siblings were so distant. The only reason he could find was his mother that was still a mystery to this day. There were no photos or paintings of her left in the mansion. The child that was once Roland couldn't recall her face either. Apparently, she had died giving birth to him but if that was the truth or not was unknown. His status was showing that he was 100% human so he didn't think she would turn out to be a demon lord like in some fantasy tales that he read in his free time. Then there were his 3 brothers. He didn't really interact with the other 2 that were of noble birth and the youngest hated his guts. The reason was also a mystery but probably it was due to this whole noble lineage nonsense. That brother's mother was also a commoner, a daughter of a merchant to be precise. He remembered a few instances where that brother of his lashed out at him. Luckily, most of the time there were people around and no fights broke out. It would be really unfortunate if he got beat up by a child only a few years older than his new body. Roland also kept to himself and avoided confrontations from happening by hiding in some secluded spots to train his skills. He wasn't sure what his brothers were up to now. Did they finish the Knight Academy and were now back at the Arden estate? Were his sisters getting married off to some nobles to gain more prestige and power? Maybe they were lucky enough to nab themselves someone that they actually liked. Normally a youth that had a warrior class and was from a noble line would go to the Knight Academy to train. Just as the name implied, it was a school for young nobles. The curriculum of such an academy varied. It wasn't just physical and combat training, a knight had to know how to read and present themselves. They would study things like etiquette, languages from other countries, history, and even accounting. A lot of went into a knight, and they had to train in particular skills to unlock the more noble versions of their classes. If you wanted to achieve a knight class first, you needed a Tier 1 squire class. Depending on the choices of other Tier 1 classes, you could rank up to a Tier 2 knight eventually. For instance, if you were lucky enough to have a Mana warrior class and a squire class, you could then quickly switch to a Tier 2 Mana knight. Then, depending on your elemental affinity, you could specialize into something like a flame knight. There were various combinations to this class as well as the others. His mind drifted away from his family and he recalled another person that was at him during that 5-year stop. It was his maid Martha that was more or less his mother figure. He had certain emotions towards that woman, but he mostly considered that to be due to the leftover feelings from his host's body. She was someone who at least cared, but if she would be willing to drop her cushy job back at the Arden estate and come here to help him out? He was living in a warehouse that would probably be quite chilly if he wasn't a blacksmith who used a lot of hot metal. There was also the problem of contacting her. Sending her a letter was one option, but it could very well be intercepted by someone from the noble house. He didn't know who hired the first assassin that went after him. There was nothing stopping that person from hiring more if they knew where he lived. Roland shook his head as he tried not to think about his old family anymore. That was something that he had left behind a long time ago. He was now more or less self-sufficient and part of the working class. His runic swords were being sold to the adventurers already, and he was earning a hefty sum for someone his age. This was still not nearly enough to start his own business though. He would probably have to go to a different town where he could set up a shop. A town where the prices for real estate were a lot lower than here. The taxes also depended on the nobles that ruled the lands. He looked over some potential new places, but he was still on the fence. It would probably be a lot easier to live his life here. He would probably get a new workshop after ranking up to Tier 2. Maybe even some Tier 1 blacksmiths as helpers, and they would be all hired through the company he was working for. Still, he would be only part of a bigger machine, just a larger cog in it, but still not his own man. Even though it was slightly troublesome, he still had dreams of starting his own workshop. He rolled to one side of his bed and then to the other before finally getting up. For some reason, he couldn't sleep. He activated the life detection magical device that he had made and couldn't see any enemies nearby. His life had gotten quite mundane after the last incident. He spent most of it working at his workshop. There were no more assassination attempts on his life for quite some time now. The gnome was holding up his part of the contract and he was well protected. Roland grabbed a stack of papers from the side and started looking through them. He was doing his own research in hopes of discovering a new skill. The people in this world were very reliant on their skills. It was thus very hard to come by any type of research materials that weren't just skill books. Those just gave a person the knowledge instantly without really giving them time to contemplate over it. It was as if a person was learning to ride a horse without having mastered walking. Riding a horse was the superior type of travel, but if you got off your horse you couldn't go anywhere. Thus it was hard for a person to research other similar skills as they lacked the basic knowledge to do so. This was why Roland was now re-educating himself. He was far too reliant on his debugging skill for his runes. Without it, he would probably not be able to improve a lesser rune by himself. At least not before he started his own research. Now he was able to see some of the patterns and even understand them on a surface level. There was a certain crafting technique he wanted to learn, the one that would boost his items to another level. It was the one that melded mana stones into the runic structure and powered them. There were two main ways that this technique worked. One was by somehow combining the sizzling hot metal with the mana stone during the smelting process. The runesmith would create a special mana alloy that would retain more ambient mana in itself. These special alloys would then allow a runesmith to make weapons with lower requirements for mana. This was the harder way of doing this, and the prices were also higher. Of course, the way of doing this was hidden away by the runesmiths. They would also charge you an arm and a leg for it, as they weren't willing to aid their competition. This was considered to be the superior technique compared to the other one. There were even superior versions of it that worked on materials other than metal. But they apparently required special smelters, techniques, and more skills that kept everything together. The second option was a lot simpler. First, you just needed to get your hands on a raw mana stone from a monster. The better the quality, the lower the mana usage would become. If you managed to get a strong enough mana stone, you could even make a weapon that didn't need any outside mana to run. After acquiring this resource, a runesmith would take an item, for instance, a sword. He would then have to craft a socket for it. Mostly he would place it in the hilt or just above the crossguard. The stone would be then inserted into the special socket. The mana stone would then turn into a battery for that item. The socket being nothing more than a conduit for the mana stone. What he really needed to find here was the correct runic structure for this socket. Fashioning an opening to fit a round object as a mana stone wasn't hard. He just needed to connect it with the main runic pathways and make a complete circuit. He already tried the direct approach, but it didn't work, so he decided to evaluate his knowledge and go back to the basics. It would be easier to get my hands on one of those runic weapons with these sockets, but then this research would lose its meaning. He had contemplated buying one of those items himself. He had earned some gold coins since getting here and could afford a common item. But then he felt like he would again rely on his debugging skill too much. Then he would probably run into another wall down the line, that one probably far greater than this one. So there he was, looking back through some chicken scratch that he called notes. The candles that he was using were of the magical kind, so they would burn for a lot longer. This didn't increase the quality of light though, as his eyes were getting tired. In a slight fit, he finally tossed a bunch of notes up into the air and leaned back in his chair. The stack of papers flew everywhere and started slowly descending after hitting the ceiling. He closed his eyes and gave out an audible sigh before feeling something land on his face. It was one of the pages that he tossed up. The moment he opened his eyes, it was before him. He removed it from his face and furrowed his brows. It was one of the runic components that he had drawn, but it was upside down. He looked at it for a second before realizing something. What if I've been looking at this issue in the wrong way? What if the mana core isn't a battery? Or if it's a combination of a battery and something else? Roland rubbed his chin. From the way he saw it, the mana stones inserted into the sockets should work as batteries. They were more or less an additional power source. Now a new idea dawned on him. What if they worked in a somewhat different way? The mana stones don't fully remove the need for a person to power the runes. They mostly just lower the requirements by a set number. They sometimes even lower the deterioration rate of the runes. What if instead of a regular battery it was some kind of cleanser or purifier? What if instead of adding ambient mana from the air, it cleansed it from some kind of impurities and thus increased the power output in that way? This started making sense now. If he imagined mana as a river filled with mud water and the mana core as a dam with a filter on it, the mana crystal would filter the mud water and only let the clean water back into the stream. He had presumed that these crystals just stored mana and added some after being socketed into the item. Now he had another theory, but if he was right, then the socket needed a whole new design. He brought out a new piece of paper and got out one of his pencils. His entire room was a mess and the floor was littered with his schematics and non-working diagrams. His fingers worked fast as he had done this multiple times already. His high dexterity stat only added to the hastening of this process. In about an hour he had a finished schematic of a sword socket for a mana stone. It was connected to the dual rune with the mana slash and thrust skills. He waited a second before activating his debugging skill, but when he did, his bottom lip began to tremble. He had previously created this combination rune and already received the experience for it. Surprisingly, adding the socket, which was apparently just called a slot, had given him some bonus experience. He modified the schematic slightly after running it through his debugging skill and gained another 100 XP for it. This opened up a new revenue stream for him. He could probably modify all the old rune schematics to have slots in them and gain some bonus XP. This wasn't important that much now though. He had finally managed to create the fabled design that he was trying to reproduce for months. He had even gained an upgraded version of his old title. Apparently, discovering new techniques in his profession did help him to gain things besides skills. He was quick to check his new title out and was pleasantly surprised by the explanation. He wasn't sure how much of a bonus this would be, but anything that boosted his crafting skills would be appreciated. Even if it was just 1%, it was worth it in the long run. The crafting process was always lengthy and this could hasten it by an hour or two. He had spent almost the whole night continuing his research and now dawn was upon him. Roland already knew what his new creation would be. He already had made the sword and would just need to make a few adjustments. The easiest way would be to punch a hole through the pommel and insert the gem into it. The hard part would be to make the crystal-like object fit without falling out. He still had the mana stone from that hobgoblin and could try to insert it there. He wasn't sure if there was a specialized skill or way to make the mana stones fit the sockets. I could try some glue or maybe polishing it. He scratched his head a bit while feeling drowsy. He had already spent too much time on this tonight and his sleep resistance skill was reaching its limit. It would probably be better to just turn in for the night. He could pick it up in the morning and try a couple of crafting techniques to embed his marble-sized mana stone into his freshly created magical sword. Roland really hoped that there wasn't some kind of special skill required for this procedure. He didn't really have even the basic knowledge to start experimenting on those slots. Now with a working schematic, he could investigate some more. The upgrade to his title even showed him that trying things yourself was far more rewarding. If there was some kind of implanting skill, he might even be able to figure it out himself. It might even be impossible to attach a working slot for a pre-made weapon and he would have to recreate it from scratch. Though, that would have to wait for another day. He was dead tired. His eyes burned from focusing on rune schematics all day. Tomorrow he would get back into his research. Maybe with some luck, he would be able to make that gauntlet he always dreamed about. Chapter 49 Calm Before the Storm. Roland was looking at a piece of steel that had a round shape. This was the old pommel that he had removed from the previously created sword. He was planning to replace this section of the sword. There were a few other places he could push the gem into, but they would be troublesome. The blade had already gone through the process of hardening, so heating it up again to insert a groove might ruin it. He could also try filing a fitting hole into the hardened blade in the hilt or slightly above it. But only filing a fitting hole wouldn't really work that well. He actually needed the gem to be held in place. He didn't have any magical techniques or materials on him that would hold it in place while allowing the mana to flow through. Having something he could just weld the thing on would probably be a good idea. For now, he chose to use one of the techniques jewelers used. The technique he would be using was called a bezel setting. This was a setting method that would hold the stone in place. It would use a raised surrounding for the stone with a lip encircling and overlapping the edges of the stone, thus holding it in place. He would craft a new pommel with a hole for the stone and some of those raised lips. After the stone was in place, he would need to push that thinner part of the metal down against the stone. This would wedge the mana crystal into the socket and keep it in there. This was one of the easiest ways for him to do this with his current skill set. Thanks to his high dexterity stat, he was quite good with his hands. Later he would have to research if there were other ways to keep those magic stones steady. He could even make the hilt wider at the end and punch a fitting hole, then hammer it shut. This would keep the gem fully on the inside but could damage it as well. There was also the problem with the mana stone being fully encased in metal. This in theory would lower its mana gathering properties by how much he would need to test it. Roland really wanted to make power tools now that would help him craft things. Due to his increased strength and endurance, he didn't really need a power hammer. He could use something like a drill to make more precise holes. With it, he could just make a screw-on pommel instead of wedging it and then hammering the part that was poking out at the end. He could really use tools like a belt grinder to help him with things like stock removal, profiling, polishing to a mirror finish. An angle grinder to cut metal would also save him a lot of time. The problem was always that such tools needed him to use up mana. This was valuable energy that he needed for rune crafting though and couldn't be wasted. Now on the other hand there was light outside the tunnel. With the help of these mana stones, he could probably lower the mana usage significantly, maybe even so much that his mana regeneration and the mana usage on the tools cancelled themselves out. First, he needed to make his first item though. Luckily the pommel was large enough to house this mana stone that he received from that hobgoblin he killed. After removing the old one he would need to make it a bit smaller than the original, as he wanted some stock to be poking out at the end to hammer it in place. He got to work right in the morning. He was someone that was consumed by his job, there was almost no day that he spent not crafting something. He wasn't such a productive person back in his old world, this was probably due to many things a person could do to procrastinate back there. Movies, games, books, and the internet, there were just so many activities that were more fun. This wasn't true in this world. When he stopped working and relaxed he found himself just sitting there with nothing to do. Roland had no friends or family to talk to, there was also no internet to surf around and spend his time. He was just left with himself and his own thoughts, thus he found himself thinking about new runes or new items he could make instead. It was time to get it done. He picked out a piece of steel that was closest in size. He would create a pommel from it. It would be similar to the previous one and in the middle, it would have a groove and a flange. This flange was just a somewhat projecting lip that would then be bent inwards to hold the mana stone in place. The mana stone would be placed into the groove and maybe polished down slightly. Though it would be better to not alter the mana stone as with a decrease in size it would lose some of its mana filtering and storing properties. The workshop soon filled with sounds of metal colliding against one another and the sound of a fast-moving grindstone. This process took some time but in the end, he had something workable. Roland needed to fit the stone into the groove of this socket. He started placing it inside and filing it further down to get the correct shape. This was probably the most annoying process as he didn't want to make the opening too large. After finally getting it into the correct shape the time to insert the runic components came. This would be another grueling process to get through. This was a smaller piece of metal than the sword's blade and he couldn't just hammer it with force. If he did that he could break it. He would need to use the harder process of forcefully inserting this by hand. There was one thing he could do to hasten the process slightly. For this, he took out a simple engraving tool made from steel. It had a wooden handle and more or less looked like a pointy nail or smaller chisel. He would engrave some of the larger runic structures into the metal on the hardened steel structure. He just had to be careful not to remove too much of the metal. If he did it correctly he would save mana and time as otherwise, his rune artifacting skill that used up MP would have to construct all the pathways and components forcefully. With a thin enough engraving the technique would not have that much steel to push against. What he was left with were precise inscriptions that almost looked like finished runes. A normal person would even think this was the finished product. Only a runesmith or someone with specialized skill would notice the missing traces. Now while concentrating with all his might the rune crafting process started. It was a lot harder to do this on a non-heated up piece of metal but within a day's time, he was finished. This wasn't quite over yet. Now the mana stone needed to be inserted into the pommel's socket. He had done a good job while making this groove so the gem fit in nicely. He didn't own any bezel setting tools yet, so he had to make do with some of his regular smithing tools. The bending process wasn't hard as he did have enhanced strength by now. Soon the new pommel made its way back onto the sword hilt. Thanks to his ethereal pathway skill he was now able to connect separate item parts with each other. This type of pathway was more similar to something like a wireless router. It was like a point in the rune circuit that would just connect to another similar one in it. One just acted as a receiver while the other was sending out the signal, so you had to plan it out in the right way as they wouldn't work otherwise. After some final touches, the new sword was complete. Roland took it into his hand and started examining it with the help of his identification skill. A little smirk appeared on his face. Steel arming sword of mana/rune, mana thrust rune slot, common mana stone, +3 strength. He looked at the additional static that the mana stone was giving. Each slotted mana stone had some kind of bonus to it. This one came from a hobgoblin berserker, and as it was a physical type of monster, it added to strength. It did also add the mana reducing properties to it, but apparently, his identification skill wasn't high enough to see just by how much. He wanted to test it out, so he walked outside. This new workshop had a bit of land around it that was walled off. He had a large thick tree log out in his backyard that would probably be good as target practice. Roland grasped his newly produced sword with one hand and did a few practice swings with it. His skill had improved since a couple of years ago. This took him back as he remembered the times that he sparred with his half-gnome assistant in this backyard. She was quite nimble and good at evading. This increased his skills and accuracy of blows. After looking back to old times, he took on a thrusting stance. This sword wasn't as long as a long sword, which mostly ranged from 100 centimeters up to 130 centimeters. It was about 90 centimeters long, hilt included, and was considered a one-handed sword. It was something between a long sword and a short sword. Before activating the skill, he was sure to look at his current mana. He knew how much MP the mana thrust required, so with some math it would be easy to tell how much energy he saved. He plunged his sword forward with one hand while injecting the minimal amount of mana. He could feel his energies flowing into the hilt and activating the runic structure inside. It felt slightly different than when he used weapons without a mana stone in them. The infused mana started getting sucked into the embedded gem. It glowed with a bright light before the whole skill activated. The whole blade glowed in a deep blue light. The energies moved towards the tip, and it looked as if a current of water was traveling to the sword point. The sword tip shone brighter before a bolt of energy shot forward. This attack looked similar to a mage's mana bolt spell, but it was a bit more concentrated. It had the same blue hue. The power of it depended not only on the user's intelligence but also on their sword skills. The moment it connected with the large piece of wood, Roland could see it shatter into many smaller pieces. The stump just exploded as the mana thrust technique punched right through it. On the other end, it collided with the ground and left a small hole in it while kicking up some dust. Roland whistled a bit while holding up the sword and looking at the whole runic structure. He had previously created swords with these runes and tested them. This one had clearly more penetrating power than the previous ones. The embedded mana stone was probably the cause of that. About 40% is it? Not bad, he said to himself while examining the glowing gem he inserted into this sword. Previously he only saw these monster cores absorbing ambient mana from the surrounding and thought they were just rechargeable batteries. Now he understood them better. They were more mana regulators than batteries. They purified the sword wielder's mana and siphoned it into the runic structure. He missed this fact previously as didn't have a pre-made product to test nor any research materials concerning it. Roland was also a bit of a Scrooge. He could have bought the cheapest weapon using this sort of mana stone and would have probably saved himself some time. He would have lost some gold coins while doing that though. He was thinking that maybe in the future it would be better to spend more on research materials. If other people weren't willing to sell skill books or research logs, then he would need to reverse engineer things himself. There was also one other peculiarity about this sword he was using. He could clearly see the skills for mana slash and mana thrust with the temporary prefix in his status when he was holding this sword. When he placed it somewhere else, these two skills would vanish as if they never existed. He even had a skill level attached to it and would even somehow know how to perform this skill. From what he could tell, it mostly depended on the rune's quality and maybe some other side factors, like sword-related skills that a person using it had. Roland would need to test things out with these. It would be nice to get free skills from powerful classes. Though these were active skills and not passive ones, if he could get passive ones was a mystery. He put his sword away and looked at the scene of destruction. The tree stump wouldn't be usable for chopping wood anymore. Even a lesser skill as the mana thrust with his stats and the help of the mana stone had a lot of power behind it. This skill belonged originally to a mana warrior class and it increased power with intelligence and strength. Roland rubbed his chin and looked at his sword design. He thought that he could probably insert a second mana stone into the hilt if he really wanted to. He could also place one on the other side of the pommel. With another one, he would be able to lower the MP usage by 80%. That was only in theory though, adding multiple mana stones could have a cap. Maybe adding another one only reduced the mana usage by half of that. Monster cores are really something I should heavily invest in. He headed back into his workshop while contemplating new products. He would probably be able to make a magic staff with many mana stones that would lower the mana usage drastically, maybe he could even spam spells without stopping. That is till the materials gave out as the steel he was working with wasn't something that could take the increased mana usage. He needed to get his hands on some deep steel or mithril. Mithril was a magical metal, it was as strong as steel but much lighter. You could also combine it with other various metallic ores without a problem. This wasn't the main reason it was so sought after though. It was mostly so popular thanks to its magic-related properties. It would exponentially boost the number of uses for enchanted and runic spells. Lesser spells wouldn't even deteriorate the rune-crafted structures at all if mithril was involved. There were other various alloys and metals that could even handle greater and grand runes. Those were not even close to something that he could afford. There were so many new items he could craft now. He had some old mana stones that he didn't sell yet. He could test them on his refrigerator first. Maybe if he inserted enough of them and lowered the mana usage to 100%, it would just work without him having to inject his own mana into it. If that worked he could start modernizing his whole smithy. Making a drill and better grinder, maybe an electric saw and something for polishing. If that was possible it would drastically reduce the crafting times and net him more experience in the long run. So he went back into his workshop, crafting diagrams in his head. He still had some time left on his contract and he would use it well. Maybe after it was up he would be able to set out on his own. He was thinking of leaving for a city for one with a newer dungeon that wasn't that highly populated. Cities like that sprung up from time to time. The dungeons formed randomly and would be used as a source of income. A dungeon always brought adventurers with them. These adventurers needed facilities like inns, pubs, and weapon shops. He could provide the latter and maybe even establish himself as a runesmith there. In new cities the grasp of wealthy companies like the one he was working for wasn't that strong. He might be able to get a small market share without getting strong-armed by the competition. Going to a city with a dungeon that has some rare ores would be nice. Dungeons were magical places, depending on the dungeon core various monsters or materials could spawn. There were even some used as mines and due to being magical dungeons, the ores would also be mystical in nature. The possibility of mithril appearing there was quite high. Roland finally returned to his workshop. He still had to make some items for the company. He had used up a lot of time by making things for himself lately. He quickly got back to his usual work while thinking about some useful utensils he could make to help him out. While Roland was hammering away, the manager that he was working for was sitting back in his own office. His lovely elven assistant was looking at him while standing at the door. "So, we aren't going to the meeting this time?" the elf asked while the alchemist gnome was looking at a vial with some blue liquid. "No, this is a very delicate process. If I leave now, a week's worth of work will go down the drain." The elf just shrugged and left. She was actually happy about this, so she didn't really mind. She could just relax and eat some pastry while her boss did his experiments. While she was stuffing her face with some cookies, some other people were moving through the night. There were 2 of them and they were jumping between roofs while not making a sound. The place that they were heading to looked to be somewhere in Highttown. They arrived unnoticed and looked from afar at a large mansion. Some carriages had gathered there and some people were slowly walking into the building. Hey Hey! Are we there yet? A woman's voice called out. The other person didn't look at the woman and just gave out an annoyed groan. Hey, don't ignore me. The woman moved her hood down and started waving her hands in front of the other person's face while making odd faces. Stop fooling around. The man replied in a hushed tone while the woman sniggered and looked at the people coming out of the carriages. We will wait till all of them are gathered, then we will strike. The man said while sinking back into the shadows, in his hand a strange red-looking double helix-shaped object. His body and the woman's started flickering in and out of existence before they faded away, the people in the mansion unaware of what was waiting for them on this cold gloomy night. Chapter 50. Things are not what they seem. A large crystal chandelier was hanging over an even bigger round table. This table had exactly 8 chairs placed around it. The chairs looked to be made by some master craftsman and even had cushioning. There were already 5 people there and they were waiting for the last person to arrive. Mr. Tharder sure is late today. An extravagantly dressed moon elf woman said while leaning back in her chair. If this wasn't official business she would have probably placed her long legs on the round table already. Lately he has been tardier, ever since our little problem was resolved. A man said while looking at an intricate golden pocket watch. This was a very rich merchant that owned most of the food-related stores in the city. He placed the watch back into his pocket and then glanced to an empty chair. The gnome gentleman from Exir sent word that he won't be arriving beforehand. That's why I don't like alchemists, always stuck in their work. They are no fun. The elven woman blew out a little smoke circle through her luscious lips while grumbling a bit. Finally the large door that led into this room opened and a fellow council member walked in. It was the dwarf called Tharder. His size had increased since the last time. As he walked his large tummy jiggled about which caused some of the merchants to cough while trying not to stare. Wits wi dem looks, am air already. The dwarf sat on his chair that was a specially made product to fit his large posterior. This was the same dwarf that the mine was sacked 1.5 years ago. He didn't look like he was going through hard times though. After the gnome manager from Exir cleared up things with the Thieves Guild everything went back to normal. He did inform the council about who the true perpetrator was as it was better to have more people on the same page. Everyone knew the noble responsible but they also knew that he couldn't really do much anymore. His secret was out, they could now retaliate but not out in the open. They were powerful merchants that the city relied on. If they united together they could force the city under. They just needed to get all of their investments and leave. The hole in the budget of the city would be horrendous if they weren't there to pay taxes. This was something that the noble knew and also why he was using underhanded methods to get them to sell their businesses to him. They weren't entirely sure why this particular noble did what he did. From what it looked it was related to money but that wasn't something they were willing to give up. Since that incident everything was quiet. The merchants spent some money on bodyguards and a more robust information network between each other. Still, the noble was quiet and didn't seem to make any more moves. The taxes didn't increase either and he didn't make any unreasonable requests, it was as if he had given up. Soon most of the council members had forgotten about this incident and moved on with their lives. It had ended quite fast due to Exir's involvement. This company was something much greater than what this city could hold. They somewhat trusted that they would not allow something like that to happen again. They were like a shield keeping them safe and it felt like they were well protected. Tharder the dwarf looked at the empty seat where the gnome was supposed to sit. The other members noticed that he wanted to say something and urged him to do so. Hey Mr. Tharder, something on your mind? Some magical weapons have been seen on th market by merfolk. He started mentioning that someone else was selling runic weapons. This dwarf was the owner of most of the smithies around the city. He made it clear that Exir was responsible for it. He wanted to ask the gnome about forking up the runesmith responsible. This was infringing on his territory but if the gnome was unwilling he couldn't really do anything but complain. On another note, the eldest son of the count will be returning from the border soon. Some of my informants told me that the campaign ended in a draw again. It will probably take them at least half a year more, but we should expect an infusion of money due to the increase of soldiers stationed here. When the soldiers came, they expected to receive orders for new and improved weapons. There would be more mouths to feed and probably a coming home feast. The surviving soldiers and knights would probably spend the money they had fought hard for. The red light district would probably be really busy by then. Is that so? How about? Another man from the council was trying to speak, but he noticed something. He looked to the side for a moment and the other council members followed his gaze. Something wrong? Asked the dwarf while straining his fat neck to where the man was looking. It was a small window up closer to the ceiling, meant more for ventilation purposes than for looking outside. This room was mostly sealed off from the outside, and there were even soldiers placed on the roofs so that no one could eavesdrop on their conversations. No, must have been my imagination. There was nothing there. The dwarf turned back to the table and the boring meeting continued. He sneaked some glances at the voluptuous elven woman here and there, as it was one of the things that made these meetings bearable. It might have seemed that he wasn't fond of her, but in reality, it was the other way around. He was a married man though, and was afraid of bad rumors spreading. A man in his position couldn't be seen interacting with an owner of the red light district. His very conservative wife would also probably chop him up with her axe. While the boring meeting continued, he noticed something peculiar. The elven woman continued to stare at him throughout the meeting. She liked to tease him here and there, but it felt like she was doing it more sensually than ever before. The other members didn't seem to have noticed and just continued with some back and forth business talks. What's that man-eater thinking? He thought to himself while the council meeting continued. Within the next 15 minutes, it was all over and the people started going back home. It was about 8 p.m. now and the city was already dark. The curfew would be starting in an hour or so. This was enough time to get to their mansions. They were rich merchants, so something like that didn't really concern them. No one would actually try to stop them. The dwarf returned to his large home in Hightown. It was one of the most extravagant mansions in the city. A large metal gate opened up and he was greeted by his servants after riding through his grand garden. There were many maids bowing with their heads waiting to welcome their master home. He walked in slowly and his coat was carried away by one of the servants. His old wife wasn't here to greet him. The two had more or less a marriage of convenience. Just two rich families getting together to become richer. He had his bath prepared and ate his meal alone. His kids were out working in some of the businesses that he owned as training and weren't here. Soon he was in his sleeping robes walking towards his huge sleeping quarters. Some of the maids knew these bed chambers as he sometimes asked them to keep him company. His wife was living in a totally different wing of this mansion. She didn't care about such things if they didn't get public and allowed her husband to have his fun. This night would be slightly different. As he walked into his room he felt a draft. The balcony was open and the drapes were fluttering around. His eyes weren't drawn to this though. There was a certain womanly figure on his bed. At first, he thought it was one of his maids, but then he noticed the long silver hair. They were almost as white as snow and the woman's body was quite sinful. She was plump in all the right places while slender in the others. Lilita? He asked with eyes bulging out, why was the owner of the red light district here and why was she naked on his bed? The woman didn't answer and just beckoned with her hand. Her plump chest shook tenderly with every hand motion that she made. The dwarf swallowed his saliva and was instantly captivated by the woman's charm. A voice in his head was telling him that there was something wrong, but something between his legs was telling him to just go forward. His target of adoration was there and there was no one here to interrupt them. The old dwarf was consumed by lust. He quickly jumped into the woman's soft embrace, his head landing between those velvety pillows. The woman hugged the old dwarf back, accepting his approach. The embrace turned into cuddling and kissing. Darter just frantically assaulted the moon elf's curvaceous body with his tongue. It was as if he felt that if he didn't act fast that the woman would disappear into the mist and he wouldn't have another chance. He started climbing on top of her to finally seal the deal, but then something unexpected happened. The alluring woman's eyes flickered with an eerie light and her fingers started contorting in unnatural ways. The dwarf hadn't noticed this yet, she was hugging him closely and his attention was elsewhere. Those digits started getting longer and longer, soon losing their shape. They looked like elongated whips and they continued expanding. Those finger-like whips quickly wrapped themselves around the dwarf's naked body, catching him off guard. What? Thardar's neck was now wrapped around by a strange-looking tendril and yanked back. The beautiful woman that he was making love to started grinning. The grin was unnatural and her lips started parting, showing quite the set of sharp teeth. Soon her whole head parted open, revealing a mass of tentacles. The woman had turned into a monstrosity set on devouring this man alive. He had nowhere to run, his neck was getting choked and he couldn't utter a word. The sound of flesh being ripped apart filled the windy room. The dwarf's head vanished from his neck deep into the horror's massive toothy mouth. "You'll get fat from that." A playful voice resounded while this horrifying scene was taking place. The monster was continuously devouring the fat dwarf and was already half done with the torso. "Bring me the others, we should hurry, not all of them are here." Another voice that sounded like a man was heard, this one was coming from the creature that was devouring the dead dwarf. The whole world started to fade away and the truth was finally revealed. The dwarf was indeed getting eaten. A man in a dark robe was standing above Thardar's corpse. He had his hand pointed at him, but it didn't look like a hand. It was a mass of tentacles that was coming out from within his robe sleeve. The tentacles were devouring the man's body along with his clothes till nothing was left. This was still the meeting room where the 6 council members were previously in. The dwarf wasn't the first person to have been devoured by this man. Only 2 other people remained. On the ground you could see a strange-looking item, it looked like a double helix. It was generating a strange sound while the runes on its surface shone in a red light. "Ah, that's why I don't like working with you abyssal warlocks. What's the fun in rushing things, not time to play." The woman pouted slightly. Her hood was down and you could see her face. She had similar features to an elf, but her skin was much darker and almost obsidian. Her eyes were pitch black and there were thick veins bulging out close to her eye sockets. She was in the middle of prancing around. She was holding on to the body of the passed-out red light district owner. The woman's head and legs dangled around as the woman did the waltz. With one strong twirl, she sent the woman's body towards the man. Her body was flung away with force as if she was a sack of potatoes. The man, without replying, turned to this person and a mass of tentacles shot out of his arm sleeve. The tentacles wrapped the elven woman's limbs up and lifted her up into the air. The thickest tentacle parted, turning into a giant set of sharp teeth that looked shark-like. Soon the body was lowered into them and devoured without even leaving the clothes behind. After the warlock was done with feasting on the flesh of all the present council members, his tentacles retracted themselves back under his robe. The woman that was with him just waited for him to pick up the magical device that made this all possible. The double helix-looking item created illusions and made the targets fall into a deep slumber. Even when their bodies were injured, they wouldn't wake up. This item was a greater magical device and would even work on Tier 3 classes. Only people with an immense amount of willpower could hope to resist it. Even then it would probably take them some time, and not like they would have any with these 2 around. There were 8 members, 2 still remain. The hoarse voice of the abyssal warlock was heard in the silent room. Making it soundproof worked against the owners in this situation. "Are we going to them?" The girl clapped her hands together while smiling. She really wanted to go towards their next target. "Yes, did you leave the mark?" The girl nodded at the question. A large occult-looking mark was left on the wall. It looked like a magic circle with strange symbols. Inside the circle beside the symbols was a strange creature. It looked like a mass of eyes surrounded by many tentacles. The 2 looked up to the small window that they came through. They had previously tossed the small magical double helix through it. The moment it landed in the room, it was activated. The people were instantly trapped in an illusion. Disposing of the affected targets afterward was quite easy. A child could even do it. The woman's body flickered as she jumped upwards, her form just phasing through the walls. The man on the other hand jumped towards the small window. His body contorted and expanded in length so that he could fit through it. He wiggled outside like a worm. The guards that were stationed on the roof were previously taken out. The two soon left the premises of this mansion heading towards their next target. They had 2 more council members to kill and the first one wasn't that far away. They had information that he was busy in his lab and would probably be there the entire night. Unbeknownst to this, another scene was playing out elsewhere. A youth that could be confused for an adult man was knocking on a door. Next to him was a lovely-looking elven girl just smiling while holding a tray with tea. This was of course Roland. He had taken his newly produced sword that he had made. He wanted to show it off and have the manager give him a good price. They could then discuss some future manufacturing plans. He wanted the company to supply him with some common-grade mana stones just as the one he used. What is he doing in there? It was already past 8 p.m. and it was getting late. He thought that he could talk it out before the day had ended, but now he was realizing that he had been hasty. Oh, you know the manager, it's just that time of the month. Want some tea while you wait? Roland grumbled under his nose. He knew this gnome well by now. When he was close to some kind of breakthrough, he would not let anyone into his office. This could continue for days or even weeks. He really wanted to talk things over, otherwise, he wouldn't know how to budget his items. No, it's fine. He decided to wait half an hour or so. If the gnome didn't finish up till then, he would come back in the morning. Zuliana just shrugged at the response and turned back to leave. There was a small waiting area on this floor, so he wanted to stay there for the time being. Suit yourself. The elven woman stopped in her tracks and did a quick 180-degree turn. She kicked down the door that almost flew open out of its hinges. Roland was surprised at the display of might and even more that she just stopped the moment the door was kicked open. Is something wrong? He asked while moving forward and peeking inside of the office. Inside was nothing out of the ordinary, just a pissed-off gnome working on some alchemy potions. What the hell do you think you are doing? Zuliana rubbed her head while holding the tea tray with one hand and apologized. Roland, not knowing what this was about, just asked if he could talk with the grumpy boss. No, don't you see that I'm in the middle of something? Just come back tomorrow and close that blasted door behind you. Roland just nodded and closed the door. The elven girl just gave him a smile as if nothing was wrong and walked down to the first floor. He didn't know what this was all about, but he never really got those two, so he just attributed it to them being weird. He decided to go home. There was no use waiting here if the manager told him that he was busy. At least he gave him a reasonable answer to coming back in the morning. Roland pulled out his sword that he wanted to show off. He activated his skill to check if everything was in place while walking towards the stairs. The moment he did, he stopped in his tracks as what he saw was quite out of the ordinary. The hell?